He had always been small for his age. That was the first thing people noticed about Orwyn Hill. They might not remember his uneven haircut or the sallow shade of his complexion, but they remembered his slight stature. For a time, he thought he would live and die as an anonymous boy in the back halls of Casterly Rock, sweeping floors or running messages between the more important folk. Yet fate has a peculiar way of nudging the inconspicuous ones into the center of grand designs. It began on a damp afternoon, winter's chill in the air, though autumn had only just surrendered. Orwyn found himself rummaging through the old archives beneath Maester Alfred's chambers. He had been assigned an endless list of chores, but the particular task of the day was sorting and tidying the oldest scrolls, those too frail to be handled by careless hands. He had carefully lifted one mildewed scroll from the rotting pile to rewrap it in leather when he noticed the faint shimmer of silver thread woven into the binding. Old parchment in the West did not usually bear such ornamentation. Curiosity overcame him. He set down the rest of the scrolls and paused to examine this particular relic. Its seal was unbroken. A small wonder, for most old documents in the rock storage had been rifled through by dozens of maesters over the generations. The seal was a dragon's head, elongated snout, eyes narrowing like slits. But it was not the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. This one had an unfamiliar flourish in its shape, the silhouette reminiscent of a serpent devouring its own tail. He felt a thrill of danger then, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was because he was only permitted to examine the contents of the scrolls if they were obviously ledgers or routine letters, items of pure historical record. Sealed documents, especially ones bearing strange devices, were never for lowly foundlings to open. But alone in the archive, with the silent dust swirling around him, Orwyn's curiosity consumed him. He half expected a haunting voice or a heavy footstep to break the stillness, but no one appeared. With trembling hands, he used a small iron pick to pry open the seal without shattering it, priding himself on his care. Inside was a piece of parchment crisp with age, the words written in High Valyrian. The script was exquisite, the letters flowing as if shaped by a master calligrapher's hand. Orwyn recognized a few scattered words: Dracarys, Valonqar, Zobri. Picked up from the long nights he spent listening outside Maester Alfred's door when the older man taught lessons to the Lannister scions. The full text, however, eluded him. Yet the shape of the words, the subtle references to secret vow and bloodfire, ignited his imagination. There was something about a lineage, a promise, a union sealed in shadow. Strange images filled his mind, conjured by the archaic syllables. He saw towering spires of fused black stone, heard the roar of dragons overhead, and glimpsed a flicker of scarlet flame behind his closed eyes. Before he could read further, Orwyn heard the echo of footsteps above. Without hesitation, he rolled up the parchment, slid it into a leather pouch beneath his tunic, and hurried to stack the other scrolls in a semblance of order. A moment later, the hatch to the archives opened, and Maester Alfred peered down, eyes narrowing through the gloom. "Boy," the old man croaked, "bring me the ledger of King Gerion's reign, quickly." Orwyn scurried forward to fetch the requested ledger, heart pounding so loudly he was sure the maester must hear it. He did not look at the man's face, nor did he speak beyond a whispered, "Yes, maester," for fear that some telltale tremble in his voice would betray him. Once he had given Alfred the ledger, Orwyn pretended to carry on with his chores. All the while, he felt the hidden scroll pressing against his ribs, as real and as dangerous as a dagger. That night, in the cramped servants' dormitory, he lay awake, listening to the hiss of wind through the cracks in the stone walls. Everyone else was asleep, lulled by the monotony of daily labors and the knowledge that another day of it would begin at sunrise. But Orwyn could not rest. The presence of that secret text weighed on his mind, heavy as lead. Hours crept past in darkness until he finally slipped out from under his threadbare blanket. He tiptoed through the corridors until he reached a disused storeroom behind the kitchens, a place where he sometimes hid to avoid the bullying japes of older stable hands. There, by the feeble light of a candle stub, he gingerly unrolled the parchment. He did not understand most of the High Valyrian words, but the ones he did manage to decipher spoke of a pact. He recognized references to the doom of Valyria, to the cataclysm that had destroyed the Empire of Dragons. He noticed an unfamiliar name, Maegor, repeated several times. That name rang no bells for him, but he guessed it was a Valyrian family that had vanished in the tumult. Then there were lines about forging a new alliance in the west, binding blood of the dragon with the ancient fires beneath the continent. It spoke of a union with serpents, and it used the word Zobri for sacrifice. A swirl of fear and excitement coursed through Orwyn. He was in over his head, handling knowledge that was never intended for the likes of him. But something deep inside him refused to let it go. The next day, he filched scraps of parchment from the kitchens and began attempting to copy the text's unfamiliar passages, replicating the shapes of the High Valyrian letters. His hand shook at first, but soon he was able to transcribe them with some accuracy. He had to proceed in secret, always aware of the risk. If he were discovered, who knew what fate might befall him? He could be thrown out of the castle or worse. Days stretched into a fortnight, and Orwyn gathered crumbs of learning as best he could. Whenever the maester or one of the Lannister tutors spoke in passing about Valyria, Orwyn clung to every word. He learned that House Maegor had indeed been one of the ruling families in Old Valyria, distinct from the freehold's hundreds of other Dragonlord families. Rumor claimed they had meddled in dark arts that made even other Valyrians uneasy. Yet, as with nearly all who traced their origins to Valyria, House Maegor was thought lost in the doom. Eventually, Orwyn gleaned from an offhand remark that there was a volume locked away in the maester's more private collection that spoke of lesser Valyrian dynasties, but no one read it but Alfred himself. It seemed an impossible dream to see that volume. He might have abandoned the quest and tried to forget the entire matter if not for a chance meeting with Tishera Sand, a Dornish woman who had come to Casterly Rock as a companion to the lady of the castle. Tishera was older than Orwyn by a few years, well into her 17th name day. She had a mischievous glint in her eyes and a fearless manner. She caught Orwyn one evening in a corner of the library, hunched over a scrap of parchment on which he was copying those arcane letters. Rather than scolding or mocking him, she asked him what it was. He froze, certain he was finished, but she only tilted her head. Curiosity sparked. Seeing no way out, he began to explain in hushed tones. He expected her to roll her eyes or laugh, but instead, she leaned forward, pressing him for details. When she learned of the hidden scroll in the archives, her eyes lit up with a fire that rivaled any golden Lannister lion. "That's quite a secret you have there," she murmured, glancing around to be sure they were alone. "Does it say something dangerous?" He told her as best he could, a rumor of a forbidden pact that had something to do with dragons, the doom of Valyria, and the possibility that certain exiled Valyrian families had sought refuge or alliances in the far west. Tishera listened, enrapt, and by the end of it she said, "We need to learn more." Orwyn blinked. "Why would you want to help? If we're caught?" She shrugged. "My life in this fortress is tedious enough, and your story is too intriguing to ignore. Also, if this rumor has any truth behind it, it could be knowledge that changes the game for great houses, for the Iron Throne, for all of us." She gave him a playful smirk. "You never know. A secret like that can be an advantage, if used wisely." The next moonlit night, Tishera and Orwyn crept down to the maester's locked study. She had filched a key from the unsuspecting Alfred while delivering a message. It was no easy feat, but Tishera was quick-fingered. Together, they slipped into the dusty chamber. Rows of old tomes and scrolls lined the shelves. By candlelight, they searched for the volume that Orwyn believed would mention House Maegor. It took a solid hour of frantic rummaging before Tishera triumphantly held up a small, thick tome with a black binding. "Annals of the Lesser Dragonlords," she read softly, "by Maester Dowen." They placed it on a wooden table, heartbeats drumming in tandem, eyes flicking to the door every few moments, fearful that someone might discover their intrusion. Tishera stood watch while Orwyn frantically leafed through the pages. Most sections detailed families that had once possessed dragons but never achieved the prestige of House Targaryen or the storied might of House Velaryon. Then, in a chapter near the middle, he found it, a treatise on House Maegor. The text described them as a particularly secretive branch of Valyrian aristocracy, rumored to delve into blood sorcery that even other dragon lords found unsettling. It hinted that the Maegers had discovered a method to bind their dragons not simply with whips and horns or traditional bonding ceremonies, but with deeper, more sinister rites requiring a sacrifice of the spirit. Tishara leaned in as Orwyn traced the lines with his finger. "The doom consumed them," he whispered. "But some whisper that a branch of the family fled, carrying the last living scion of their lineage across the sea." There was a small footnote referencing fragments of a letter discovered in the wreckage of a Valyrian outpost. The letter spoke of forging a dragon pact with the old powers lurking beneath Westeros, referencing hidden places in the mountains of the Sunset Kingdom. The wind outside moaned, rattling the shutters. Orwyn felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This lined up too well with the scroll he had discovered. He recalled the words about forging new alliances in the West, an unholy vow sealed by flames and blood. Could House Maegor have survived the doom in some secret way, weaving their fate into Westeros's future? Or was it only an old rumor, a half-forgotten legend? Tishara's eyes glinted in the candle's light. "We need more. Something that can confirm or deny it for certain." Orwyn nodded. "But where?" She turned to scan the shelves. "Some of these maesters compile references to relics, old artifacts. Perhaps that's a lead. If someone from House Maegor came to Westeros, maybe they brought something from Valyria with them, something that remains behind, hidden away." The hour was growing very late, and they risked discovery every passing moment. In the end, they only had time for a quick search. They found a mention of an artifact called the Serpent's Egg, rumored to be a twisted, scaled stone that some believed was a dragon egg corrupted by dark sorceries. It was last known to be in the possession of a certain family in the Westerland centuries ago, a family that died out or changed names. The text did not specify, but apparently that was not the only artifact. Another footnote referenced a Valyrian steel blade. Well, many houses in Westeros boasted such weapons, but this one, called Cenarion, was said to bear runes that marked a different heritage than those used by Targaryens. The text was frustratingly vague, lacking any conclusive detail. Orwyn had read enough to suspect it might point to a remnant of House Maegor or a related cadet branch. But these were just puzzle pieces scattered across centuries. Then the candle guttered. They heard footsteps in the corridor and froze. Fortunately, the steps faded, but that was enough of a warning. Tishara nodded, carefully placing everything back as they had found it. Orwyn blew out the candle, and they crept away in darkness. By the time they parted ways in the near-deserted hallway, Orwyn's head was spinning with possible leads, each more outlandish than the last. But he could not let it go. By day, he performed his usual chores, invisible to the proud lords and ladies walking the halls. By night, he pored over every snippet of information he could gather. Tishara helped him when she could, though her official duties often kept her busy. She had the ear of several knights and lesser courtiers, gleaning rumors of old houses and half-forgotten legends. One story from a gray-haired guard told of a keep in the nearby mountains, so ancient that parts of its foundation predated the coming of the Undulls. The locals called it High Pyre, for it stood near a mineral deposit that occasionally glowed red in the sunrise. It had once belonged to a family rumored to dabble in forbidden rites centuries ago. Another tale, from a traveling singer passing through Lannisport, spoke of a tapestry hidden in the dusty vault of a minor lord's hall that depicted men in pale robes bowing before a great serpent with wings of shadow. Sometimes Orwyn felt foolish chasing these scraps. He had begun with a single stolen scroll, discovered by accident. Now he was unraveling threads that wove back to the very heart of Valyria's downfall. He half expected a day to come when a tall figure in black robes would appear in a corridor and snatch him up, condemning him to some dark fate for prying into secrets beyond his station. But no such figure ever appeared. The days turned into weeks. Winter's approach chilling the coasts. The rock's great hearths burned day and night. In that hush of nearing winter, the unthinkable happened. Tishara came to Orwyn one morning, excitement dancing in her face. She had learned that the Lady of the Rock intended a visit to one of her bannermen who resided near the mountain passes. She was taking Tishara along, and they would be staying at a castle built on a promontory overlooking an ancient valley, none other than the rumored High Pyre. It belonged to an old knightly house, long overshadowed by their Lannister overlords, but still proud in their traditions. Tishara insisted that Orwyn find a way to join the escort, or at least follow it. "We might find some clue," she whispered, half giddy with anticipation. How could we pass such an opportunity? Orwyn's imagination fired. He managed, through a bit of cunning, to secure a place with the traveling retinue. One of the footmen took ill, and Orwyn volunteered to carry messages for Maester Alfred. The Maester would not journey himself, but he required a messenger to deliver some official letters to the steward at High Pyre. It was perfect. A fortnight later, they set out from Casterly Rock. The wind whipped through the high passes, and the retinue's cloaks flapped like a flock of crows. They traveled on horseback and in wagons, winding along narrow roads that clung precariously to the rocky slopes. Nights were cold, but the first snows had yet to stick. Tishara rode in the enclosed carriage with the lady. Orwyn was relegated to a cart bearing provisions, huddling among barrels of salted fish and flour. Despite the discomfort, he couldn't help a spark of exhilaration. Here he was, an insignificant foundling, journeying beyond the rock, pursuing a secret that might connect him to the lost age of dragons. High Pyre was less grand than Casterly Rock, but still impressive in its own stark way. It perched on an outcropping of jagged stone, with ancient walls blackened in places as if by old fires. The gatehouse was tall, its portcullis showing rust around the edges. Within, the courtyard felt cramped, overshadowed by the steep mountains rising on three sides. Orwyn glimpsed patches of black-veined rock in the surrounding peaks, reminiscent of stories he'd read about volcanic stone from Valyria. The shape of those ridges set his pulse racing. They bore a haunting resemblance to the fused towers he had imagined when reading the scroll. Lord Morin, the master of High Pyre, greeted the Lady of the Rock with the courtesy due her station. He was an aging man with a lined face and hawk-like eyes. His shoulders drooped as though weighed down by many cares. Orwyn noticed that the men in the courtyard seemed fewer than one might expect for a keep of this size, and many repairs went unfinished. A sad place, Orwyn thought. But Tishara, who found a chance to speak to him privately later that day, insisted, "This place has secrets. I can feel it." They had only a few nights before the lady would return to Casterly Rock, so they had to act quickly. Tishara had become adept at wandering the halls as if she belonged everywhere, gleaning bits of gossip from servants, checking locked doors, observing which parts of the castle seemed neglected. By the second evening, she discovered that there was an old tower, long sealed off, that the local folk believed was haunted. Whispers spoke of flickering lights seen at its windows at night, though no one used that tower. Its entrance was supposedly bricked over, but some said a small postern door remained, half hidden by ivy. Tishara relayed these rumors to Orwyn as they walked through a chilly cloister. That same evening, Orwyn delivered the Maester's letters to High Pyre's steward, a cautious man named Euler, who eyed Orwyn suspiciously while reading them. Orwyn, feigning curiosity about the keep's history, managed to inquire if there were any archives or old records he could see. Euler's lips tightened, and he responded that any records of High Pyre's past were meager and mostly lost in a fire decades ago. He was polite but firm. Orwyn dared not press further for fear of arousing suspicion. That night, the lady and her entourage dined in the great hall with Lord Morin. Orwyn took his supper in the servants' quarters, but Tishara, serving at table, reported to him afterward that the conversation had been polite but stiff. No mention of the keep's history or any old legends had arisen, at least not at the high table. Still, Tishara's instincts screamed that something was hidden in that tower. So, once the castle quieted and the feast was done, she led Orwyn through a side courtyard, their cloaks wrapped tight against the biting wind. Torchlight from the ramparts flickered overhead, but the guards were few, likely trusting the mountainous terrain as their main defense. They found a small postern gate behind a cluster of overgrown vines. Tishara cut away some of the tangled vegetation with a small dagger, revealing hinges caked with rust. After a few minutes of prying, the door gave way with a shriek that made Orwyn's heart lurch. They paused, breath held, waiting to see if any guard came to investigate. Silence. The night wind moaned, but no voices stirred. Carefully, they slipped inside. A narrow corridor led to a spiral stair that rose into the darkness. The air felt stale, thick with dust and the ghosts of old memories. Orwyn's torch cast long shadows on the winding walls. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains. Step by step, they ascended, every footfall seeming too loud. Twice, they paused at small landings, where battered doors opened into cramped chambers full of debris. Broken furniture, scraps of cloth, and the skeletal remains of rats lay scattered about. No sign of recent habitation, yet the place did not feel entirely abandoned. Orwyn caught a whiff of something acrid, like sul, fur or burned hair. He saw Tishera's nose twitch, as if she smelled it too. Finally, they reached the topmost level. A single large chamber awaited them, its door sagging on half-broken hinges. They slipped inside. Starlight streamed through 3 windows, barely sufficient to see by. Orwyn raised his torch to find the floor strewn with charred fragments of what might once have been books, or perhaps tapestries. It was impossible to tell, for nearly everything was burned. In the gloom, the walls gleamed faintly, as though slick with moisture. He moved closer, raising the torch. No, not moisture. Someone had scrawled symbols in a dark, congealed substance, now dried. The shapes resembled Valyrian letters, but twisted, as if spelled by a madman. Tishera drew a sharp breath, her eyes darting to the floor, where a large circle had been marked. More of that same dried substance traced a ring around the center of the chamber. Felt ominous, oppressive. Orwyn's mouth went dry. He recognized some of the shapes from the scroll he had discovered. A word repeated several times. Zobri. Sacrifice. The strangest discovery lay at the center of the circle. A stone basin, or perhaps an old brazier, sat cracked on the floor. It was made of black rock shot through with gray veins, and the rim bore carvings of serpentine creatures with wings. Orwyn saw the flicker of reflection on a puddle within the basin. Tishera stepped closer, leaning over to see. The liquid inside was thick, dark, possibly old blood or a mixture of something far more foul. She gagged at the stench that rose from it. Before they could examine further, Orwyn heard a footstep on the stair behind them. He spun, heart hammering, to see the silhouette of a man at the threshold. Torchlight from the corridor revealed Lord Morin. His face was contorted with fury and fear, and in his hand he clutched a sword. Behind him stood 2 guards. "What are you doing here?" Morin snapped, voice trembling. "This tower is forbidden." Tishera and Orwyn stared, trapped. They had no plausible lie ready. The circle on the floor, the scrawls on the walls. Anyone discovering them here would assume the worst. For a moment, Orwyn contemplated flight, but there was no route of escape aside from the stairs, which Morin and his guards blocked. When neither Tishera nor Orwyn spoke, Morin took a step forward. "This tower is sealed for a reason. Who told you of it?" Tishera squared her shoulders, her voice surprisingly steady. "No one told us. We heard rumors, that's all. We were curious." "Curious?" Morin echoed, flicking his gaze to the vile markings. He exhaled, and Orwyn saw a shadow of shame pass over his features. "You do not understand what you've stumbled upon. This is old history, damned and buried." Tishera hesitated, searching for a gambit. We saw these symbols. They appear Valyrian." Morin's knuckles whitened around his sword hilt. Then, much to Orwyn's shock, the Lord barked an order to his guards. "Leave us." The guards glanced at each other in confusion. "Go," he repeated, stepping aside to let them pass down the stair. Reluctantly, they obeyed. When their footfalls had faded, Morin turned back to Tishera and Orwyn. "This place belongs to my ancestors, and the darkness they embraced." He raised the torch, illuminating the scorched remains. "Long ago, my family, House Pyrmont, swore oaths to a traveler from Valyria who claimed to be the last of an ancient line. He spoke of harnessing powers to protect our house from all foes. He promised that if we aided him, if we performed his rites, we would share in the might of dragons. Morin let out a bitter laugh. They were fools, my ancestors. This so-called dragon lord was a scion of House Maegor, or so he claimed. He had no dragons by then, but he possessed knowledge of vile sorceries. My forebears let him perform these rituals in the dead of night, rituals that demanded blood. The rumors spread, and eventually, the king's men came, scouring our lands. Many died. Some said the dark magics unleashed a blight upon the keep, cursing it for generations. He paused, eyes flicking to Tishara, then Orwyn. We bricked this tower up long ago, hoping to bury the shame. But sometimes, travelers sense something, like a residue of that foul power. Orwyn's breath caught. So House Maegor did survive the doom? At least one survivor did. Morin grimaced. So the man claimed. Whether he truly was of Maegor blood, I cannot say. He had no proof but his words, and the unnatural knowledge he possessed. My ancestors believed him. It was said that on stormy nights, shapes like serpents coiled in the clouds above the tower, but no real dragons were ever seen. He swallowed, as though the memory itself tasted foul. The only legacy left behind is the stain of these rites. Over time, my house has tried to atone for what was done here. Tishara moved to the circle, gazing at the black basin. Were these rites continued even after your ancestors died? The blood here looks not fresh, but not centuries old. Morin's silence was telling. He looked away, and Orwyn saw guilt in his eyes. I discovered, not long after I inherited this keep, that my father had dabbled in these rituals, believing them a path to wealth or power. It did nothing but bring us more ruin. So I sealed the tower. He let out a shuddering breath. I do not know who else might have tried to continue them since. A hush fell over the chamber. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains. Orwyn felt a jolt of realization. If some loyalists to that supposed Maegor had persisted through the centuries, might they still exist elsewhere in Westeros, secretly preserving these rites? Was this the forbidden dragon pact the scroll had hinted at? A pact that extended from old Valyria's doom to a new, hidden legacy in the Sunset Lands? The thought terrified him. Lord Morin, noticing Orwyn's shaken expression, lowered his sword. I should throw you in the dungeon for trespassing, but perhaps it is better you know the truth than spread half-truths. If the Lady of the Rock discovered this tower's secrets, we'd be undone. Tishara spoke carefully. We did not come here to cause harm. We only wanted to learn if there was any truth in the old rumors. Morin studied her, then Orwyn. His face softened with resignation. What do you intend to do with what you've found? It was Orwyn who answered. We seek knowledge. We need to know if the old Valyrian line that practiced these rites still survives. If there's a chance that House Maegor or their cult remains, it could threaten the realm. A bitter smile touched Morin's lips. If they remain, they keep themselves hidden well. My father died of fever, raving about serpents coiling in dreams. I know not if he was truly in contact with others. Perhaps you can discover more beyond these walls. I have done my part by sealing this place, preserving what little honor my house has left. He gestured for them to descend. They followed in silence. At the postern door, he barred their way a moment, as though reconsidering his decision to free them. Ultimately, he stepped aside. In the morning, you shall depart with your lady. You will say nothing about what you found here. If you're wise, you'll leave these damned secrets alone. Tishara inclined her head. Orwyn whispered his thanks. They left him standing in that dark corridor, alone with ghosts of a grim past. Come dawn, the retinue departed high pyre. The Lady of the Rock complained of the drafty halls and the meager feast, eager to return to more comfortable surroundings. Orwyn and Tishara rode with the rest, hearts heavy with new knowledge. They experienced fur or burned hair. He saw Tishara's nose twitch, as if she smelled it too. Finally, they reached the topmost level. A single large chamber awaited them, its door sagging on half-broken hinges. They slipped inside. Starlight streamed through 3 windows, barely sufficient to see by. Orwyn raised his torch to find the floor strewn with charred fragments of what might once have been books, or perhaps tapestries. It was impossible to tell, for nearly everything was burned. In the gloom, the walls gleamed faintly, as though slick with moisture. He moved closer, raising the torch. No, not moisture. Someone had scrawled symbols in a dark, congealed substance, now dried. The shapes resembled Valyrian letters, but twisted, as if spelled by a madman. Tishara drew a sharp breath, her eyes darting to the floor, where a large circle had been marked. More of that same dried substance traced a ring around the center of the chamber. Felt ominous, oppressive. Orwyn's mouth went dry. He recognized some of the shapes from the scroll he had discovered. A word repeated several times. Zobri. Sacrifice. The strangest discovery lay at the center of the circle. A stone basin, or perhaps an old brazier, sat cracked on the floor. It was made of black rock shot through with gray veins, and the rim bore carvings of serpentine creatures with wings. Orwyn saw the flicker of reflection on a puddle within the basin. Tishara stepped closer, leaning over to see. The liquid inside was thick, dark, possibly old blood or a mixture of something far more foul. She gagged at the stench that rose from it. Before they could examine further, Orwyn heard a footstep on the stair behind them. He spun, heart hammering, to see the silhouette of a man at the threshold. Torchlight from the corridor revealed Lord Morin. His face was contorted with fury and fear, and in his hand he clutched a sword. Behind him stood 2 guards. "What are you doing here?" Morin snapped, voice trembling. "This tower is forbidden." Tishara and Orwyn stared, trapped. They had no plausible lie ready. The circle on the floor, the scrawls on the walls. Anyone discovering them here would assume the worst. For a moment, Orwyn contemplated flight, but there was no route of escape aside from the stairs, which Morin and his guards blocked. When neither Tishara nor Orwyn spoke, Morin took a step forward. "This tower is sealed for a reason. Who told you of it?" Tishara squared her shoulders, her voice surprisingly steady. "No one told us. We heard rumors, that's all. We were curious." "Curious?" Morin echoed, flicking his gaze to the vile markings. He exhaled, and Orwyn saw a shadow of shame pass over his features. "You do not understand what you've stumbled upon. This is old history, damned and buried." Tishara hesitated, searching for a gambit. We saw these symbols. They appear Valyrian." Morin's knuckles whitened around his sword hilt. Then, much to Orwyn's shock, the Lord barked an order to his guards. "Leave us." The guards glanced at each other in confusion. "Go," he repeated, stepping aside to let them pass down the stair. Reluctantly, they obeyed. When their footfalls had faded, Morin turned back to Tishara and Orwyn. "This place belongs to my ancestors, and the darkness they embraced." He raised the torch, illuminating the scorched remains. "Long ago, my family, House Pyrmont, swore oaths to a traveler from Valyria who claimed to be the last of an ancient line. He spoke of harnessing powers to protect our house from all foes. He promised that if we aided him, if we performed his rites, we would share in the might of dragons." Morin let out a bitter laugh. "They were fools, my ancestors. This so-called dragon lord was a scion of House Maegor, or so he claimed. He had no dragons by then, but he possessed knowledge of vile sorceries. My forebears let him perform these rituals in the dead of night, rituals that demanded blood. The rumors spread, and eventually, the king's men came, scouring our lands. Many died. Some said the dark magics unleashed a blight upon the keep, cursing it for generations." He paused, eyes flicking to Tishara, then Orwyn. "We bricked this tower up long ago, hoping to bury the shame. But sometimes, travelers sense something, like a residue of that foul power." Orwyn's breath caught. "So House Maegor did survive the doom?" "At least one survivor did." Morin grimaced. "So the man claimed. Whether he truly was of Maegor blood, I cannot say. He had no proof but his words, and the unnatural knowledge he possessed. My ancestors believed him. It was said that on stormy nights, shapes like serpents coiled in the clouds above the tower, but no real dragons were ever seen. He swallowed, as though the memory itself tasted foul. The only legacy left behind is the stain of these rites. Over time, my house has tried to atone for what was done here. Tishara moved to the circle, gazing at the black basin. Were these rites continued even after your ancestors died? The blood here looks not fresh, but not centuries old. Morin's silence was telling. He looked away, and Orwyn saw guilt in his eyes. I discovered, not long after I inherited this keep, that my father had dabbled in these rituals, believing them a path to wealth or power. It did nothing but bring us more ruin. So I sealed the tower. He let out a shuddering breath. I do not know who else might have tried to continue them since. A hush fell over the chamber. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains. Orwyn felt a jolt of realization. If some loyalists to that supposed Maegor had persisted through the centuries, might they still exist elsewhere in Westeros, secretly preserving these rites? Was this the Forbidden Dragon Pact the scroll had hinted at? A pact that extended from old Valyria's doom to a new, hidden legacy in the Sunset Lands? The thought terrified him. Lord Morin, noticing Orwyn's shaken expression, lowered his sword. I should throw you in the dungeon for trespassing, but perhaps it is better you know the truth than spread half-truths. If the Lady of the Rock discovered this tower's secrets, we'd be undone. Tishara spoke carefully. We did not come here to cause harm. We only wanted to learn if there was any truth in the old rumors. Morin studied her, then Orwyn. His face softened with resignation. What do you intend to do with what you've found? It was Orwyn who answered. We seek knowledge. We need to know if the old Valyrian line that practiced these rites still survives. If there's a chance that House Maegor or their cult remains, it could threaten the realm. A bitter smile touched Morin's lips. If they remain, they keep themselves hidden well. My father died of fever, raving about serpents coiling in dreams. I know not if he was truly in contact with others. Perhaps you can discover more beyond these walls. I have done my part by sealing this place, preserving what little honor my house has left. He gestured for them to descend. They followed in silence. At the postern door, he barred their way a moment, as though reconsidering his decision to free them. Ultimately, he stepped aside. In the morning, you shall depart with your lady. You will say nothing about what you found here. If you're wise, you'll leave these damned secrets alone. Tishara inclined her head. Orwyn whispered his thanks. They left him standing in that dark corridor, alone with ghosts of a grim past. Come dawn, the retinue departed high pyre. The Lady of the Rock complained of the drafty halls and the meager feast, eager to return to more comfortable surroundings. Orwyn and Tishara rode with the rest, hearts heavy with new knowledge. They exchanged few words on the journey back, each wrestling with the chilling implications of what they had seen. Back in Casterly Rock, the season had turned. Winter's chill had taken hold, frost coating the battlements each morning. For a time, Orwyn and Tishara were inundated with duties, and they had no chance to pursue their investigation. Yet the secrets they carried simmered beneath the surface. At night, Orwyn sometimes dreamed of scaly beasts crawling through the bowels of the castle, the walls echoing with inhuman whispers. Tishara confided that she, too, felt a sense of foreboding, as if they had awakened something better left buried. Eventually, Tishara managed to glean further rumors from travelers. Word had come of an old ruined fortress in the Reach, near the border with Dorne, where strange lights were seen dancing on the battlements under the moon. Another story told of a hidden valley in the Stormlands where the ground reeked of sulfur and no birds sang. These were only scraps, but they pointed to a pattern. Places where the aftershocks of Valyrian sorcery might linger. Some believed that certain exiled families or cults had scattered across Westeros, each performing secret rites in the hope of resurrecting the power of dragons. Orwyn recalled the lines in that hidden scroll. The flame may perish in one land, but it shall rise in another, with new blood to feed it. He shuddered. The Targaryens had famously brought dragons to Westeros, forging the Seven Kingdoms. But was there another attempt, hidden in the shadows, to reclaim Valyria's twisted legacy? If so, how close had it come to succeeding? Could it still succeed? Days passed into weeks, and Orwyn grew bolder in his search. Stealthily, he gained entry to Maester Alfred's private library. Carefully, he rummaged through references to Valyrian outposts. He discovered mention of a fortress in southwestern Westeros once known as Darkspire, rumored to have been built by exiled Valyrians in the century following the Doom. It was said that strange chanting was heard on its walls, but eventually the fortress was sacked by Undull lords who found the rites there unholy. The fortress changed hands many times, ultimately falling to ruin. Tishara listened with shining eyes, though her voice trembled when she spoke. "What if we went there?" Orwyn stared at her as if she were mad, but she pressed on. "We both know that reading about these places can only reveal so much. If you truly want to uncover whether this forbidden dragon pact persists, we have to see these sites for ourselves. Darkspire might hold more clues. Some hidden crypt, some record, who knows?" He hesitated. Their daring foray at High Pyre had been dangerous enough, and they'd barely escaped punishment. Darkspire was leagues away, beyond Lannister territory. They would have no protection there, no knowledge of local politics. And winter was tightening its icy grip on the roads. Yet the hunger for answers burned in him. "We don't have permission to leave," he said slowly. "We're both bound to service." Tishara gave him that mischievous smirk. "We can slip away for a fortnight if we must. I'll arrange some excuse with the lady, perhaps that I'm delivering a wedding gift to a minor house in the Reach. No one pays much mind to a bastard-born companion traveling with a single stable boy." And so it was decided, albeit with trembling hearts. Over the next few days they gathered supplies, a couple of decent mounts, traveling cloaks, coins stolen from purses that wouldn't miss it too much. Tishara used her cunning to secure a paper bearing the lady's seal, claiming they were on official business. Orwyn secretly packed the translated notes he'd made from the Forbidden Scroll. If Darkspire contained further evidence of House Maegor's lingering presence, he wanted to compare it against those old Valyrian phrases. They left quietly at dawn, unremarked among the bustle of the castle's daily comings and goings. The road south took them through rolling hills and villages huddled under early frosts. They stuck to known routes, mindful of bandits. Tishara's archery skills provided small game when inns off. Likely it was used for storage, maybe crypts as well. "The passage is blocked by debris. I've been trying to clear it alone, with little success." He fixed them with a hopeful stare. "If we join forces, we might discover whatever's down there." It was dangerous, of course. The fortress was abandoned for a reason. Collapsed masonry could trap them. If rumors of secret cult activity were true, a living threat might also lurk below. Yet neither Tishara nor Orwyn hesitated long. This was what they'd come for, to find tangible proof of the hidden vow that might connect House Maegor's dark legacy from the Doom to Westeros's present. So they agreed to help. By the dim morning light, they picked their way through a side passage in the fortress's collapsed keep. At the end of a corridor strewn with fallen stones, they found a door half buried in rubble. Hessen had cleared some of it, revealing a yawning black gap beneath. Together, they labored to move aside a few larger stones. Their muscles ached from the cold. Finally, the opening was wide enough for them to squeeze through one by one. A short tunnel sloped downward, walls slick with condensation. The air smelled of rot and stale earth. They lit torches and pressed on, carefully testing each step. The passage ended in a large chamber. At first glance, it looked like a wine cellar, with stone racks for casks. Most were empty or broken. Broken glass crunched underfoot, perhaps from flasks or bottles long shattered. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by their intrusion. In one corner, a spiral staircase led deeper still. They followed it, hearts pounding. The steps wound into an even lower chamber. There, at last, they found something that made Orwyn's blood run cold. Carvings on the walls, partially chipped away but still visible in places, depicting serpents or dragons entangled with human figures. The style was reminiscent of Valyrian art, the lines fluid and elegant, yet also unsettling. A few runes in High Valyrian script were carved beneath. Tishara, scanning the walls with her torch, said, "This is it. They must have conducted their rites here." Hessen moved closer, eyes gleaming with scholarly fervor. "Yes, see here, these runes speak of the Draharian rite, said to call forth the spirit of the dragon from the underworld. It's older than standard Valyrian practices. It might predate the freehold civilized era, going back to the age when Valyrians were more akin to warlocks." Orwyn felt a prickling at the nape of his neck. He glanced around. "Are we alone?" A moment later, a rustling noise answered from somewhere in the darkness. Tishara whipped around, dagger drawn. Hessen tensed, raising his torch. For a breathless moment, they heard only their own breathing. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, clad in ragged black robes, hair hanging in greasy strands around a gaunt face. The figure's eyes shone with feverish intensity in the torchlight. "You come to disturb the sanctum?" The figure hissed. Orwyn could not tell if it was a man or a woman. The voice was low, rasping with anger or madness. "This place belongs to the Keeper's children." Tishara stepped between Orwyn and the robed figure, brandishing her dagger. "We mean no harm," she lied. "We only want to learn." The figure snarled a laugh, revealing broken, yellowed teeth. "Learn? The knowledge here is not for outsiders." Hessen tried a gentler tone. "We bear no ill will. If you guard this place, then perhaps we can speak." "Silence!" the figure spat, dropping to a crouch. Orwyn saw a flash of steel in the figure's hand. Another knife? Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. 2 more figures in dark robes, creeping from another tunnel. They had them surrounded. Fear jolted Orwyn's limbs. Tishara braced herself, cursing under her breath. Hessen clutched a staff he'd brought, looking more scholar than warrior. The robed intruders spread out, forming a semicircle. "You trespass on sacred ground," the first figure intoned. "Your blood will feed the flame." With that, they lunged. Tishara sidestepped, slashing at the attacker's arm. A shrill cry echoed as her dagger scored flesh. Hessen swung his staff clumsily, driving back a second figure who tried to stab him in the belly. Orwyn gripped his torch like a cudgel, swinging wildly at a third assailant. The clash of steel on stone reverberated in the cramped chamber. Flickering torchlight cast frenzied shadows on the walls, animating the carved dragons as if they writhed in sadistic glee. The robed figures fought with feral desperation, hissing curses in some guttural language. Orwyn recognized bits of Valyrian, though twisted and archaic. He managed to strike one cultist on the shoulder with the torch, setting the robe aflame. The cultist screeched, rolling on the ground to extinguish it. Meanwhile, Tishara displayed remarkable agility, darting away from each thrust and slicing at exposed arms or legs. Hessen struggled more but managed to keep his attacker at bay by jabbing with the staff. One cultist toppled, blood staining the floor. Another, wounded by Tishara's blade, bared rotten teeth, then turned to run deeper into the labyrinth. The remaining robed figure staggered, holding a burned arm, then fled the same way, vanishing into the darkness with ragged breaths echoing behind. In the aftermath, Orwyn's heart thundered. Tishara and Hessen were both panting, bruised but not gravely hurt. The wounded cultist on the floor groaned weakly. Tishara pressed her dagger to the figure's throat. "Who are you?" she demanded. A mad grin curled the cultist's lips. "We are the keepers of the true flame. You come too late. The vow is sealed. The seeds have been sown across the land." A tremor of pain racked the cultist's body. "You cannot stop the dragon's return." Orwyn's thoughts whirled. "You speak of House Maegor's vow?" A rasping laugh. "Maegor, yes. The old blood stirs. Do you think the Targaryens were the only ones to survive? Fools. The flame burns in the shadows, waiting." Tishara's eyes flicked to Orwyn, then back. Where is the vow kept?" But the cultist only laughed again, spitting blood. In the hearts of those chosen, the realms of men shall burn once more. The cultist's eyes glazed, and the body went limp. A chill seized Orwyn. The words replayed in his mind. The vow is sealed. Seeds have been sown across the land. Had they stumbled upon only one outpost of a widespread conspiracy, each cell working to resurrect Valyria's darkest legacy? The thought was horrifying and bizarrely enthralling. Hessen knelt, breathing hard. They're truly here. This is proof. Cultists upholding House Maegor's blood ritual tradition. They must have scattered through the centuries, passing down lore in secret enclaves. By the gods, how far does this spread? Tishara rose, wiping her blade on the cultist's robe. We can't fight them all, but we can bring word to those who might. If the realm learns of a clandestine movement to birth new dragons, or something akin to dragons, people might take it seriously. Orwyn felt a knot of dread. Or they might laugh at us, or worse, think we're mad or traitors ourselves. Hessen sighed. There's no easy path, but with the right evidence, certain maesters, certain lords, might heed the warning. He turned his gaze to the far wall, where an archway led deeper into the crypt-like structure. But before we go, we should see if there's any further documentation, any ledger or relic that can be shown as proof. Otherwise, it's our word alone. Though weary and shaken, Tishara and Orwyn agreed. They pressed deeper into the labyrinth, wary of more cultists. The corridors branched several times, leading to small chambers that might once have been storerooms. The flickering torchlight revealed nothing but refuse and filth. At last, they discovered a locked iron gate, rusted shut. A little force with Hessen's staff broke it open. Inside that chamber, they found an ancient stone altar and racks of tattered scrolls. The torch smoke stung their eyes as they approached. Some scrolls were destroyed by damp or gnawed by vermin, but a few remained partially legible. The altar bore carvings of winged serpents, their eyes set with small garnets that glowed red in the torchlight. In front of it lay a half-rotted wooden chest. Tishara pried it open with her dagger. Inside, they found a tarnished silver chalice engraved with more Valyrian runes and a short blade of Valyrian steel, its hilt wrapped in decaying leather. Hessen sucked in a sharp breath, his voice trembling in excitement. These are relics, possibly from the time of old Valyria. Orwyn lifted the chalice, running a thumb over the inscriptions. The writing was archaic High Valyrian. One phrase repeated, "He who drinks of blood shall bind the flame." He felt a shudder run through him and carefully set it aside. Tishara, meanwhile, examined the blade. It had an oily sheen, typical of Valyrian steel, but its shape was unusual, thinner and slightly curved, reminiscent of some Essosi designs. The crossguard was etched with serpentine patterns. Hessen began carefully unrolling one of the scrolls. "Look here. It's a ritual text. Mentions the keeper of the Draconis vow. Sacrifices by fire. Designed to awaken a slumbering Ash Wrm. The text is incomplete, but it references multiple sites across Westeros. High Pyre is named. Darksong Caverns in the Vale. Something about a black crypt beneath Storm's End." Tishara looked grim. "So there might be enclaves everywhere." "Yes," Hessen murmured, scanning the text. "If these enclaves remain active, they could coordinate. The question is to what end? Do they genuinely believe they can birth or summon dragons? Or is it all madness?" "We can't dismiss it as mere madness," Orwyn said quietly. "We've seen how determined they are to spill blood for their cause. Even if they can't succeed in creating dragons, they can cause plenty of horror trying. They gathered as many intact scrolls as they could, along with the chalice and blade. This would serve as evidence, if they survived to present it." The tension in the air weighed heavily, and they resolved to leave before more cultists returned in force. Retracing their steps, they found the fortress silent. Outside, the winter sky was dark, flecks of snow drifting. They quietly fetched their horses, hearts pounding at every rustle in the gloom, expecting an ambush. But no one emerged. The fortress stood empty, a tomb for secrets both ancient and ongoing. Huddled together under a makeshift shelter near the fortress outskirts, they whispered about what to do next. Hessen suggested traveling to Old Town, to the Citadel, where a few open-minded maesters might be persuaded to examine the relics and confirm their authenticity. Tishra pointed out that traveling all the way to Old Town with cultists on their trail was dangerous. In the end, they decided to part ways. Hessen would venture east toward the Reach's more populous cities, aiming to reach Old Town eventually. He would carry the blade and a selection of the scrolls as proof. Tishra and Orwyn would return north to Casterly Rock, bringing the chalice and additional documents. If either party was waylaid, hopefully the other would succeed. They exchanged solemn farewells. Hessen departed at first light, slipping away into the rolling hills. Tishra and Orwyn lingered a while, letting their horses rest. In a moment of silence, Tishra turned the silver chalice in her hands, gazing at its etched runes. "We've uncovered something terrifying, Orwyn," she said softly. "But in a strange way it feels important. I can't just go back to being a lady's companion, pretending none of this is real." Orwyn nodded, understanding too well. "I was just a foundling, a boy nobody noticed. Now I'm entangled in the fate of dragons, or what's left of them. It's unreal. But we must do what we can. Even if that means telling the Lannisters or the Citadel. Perhaps they'll believe us." She gave him a faint smile. "At least we're in this together." They rode north, wary and watchful. The journey was fraught with winter storms, forcing them to seek shelter in roadside inns when possible. They saw no sign of cultists chasing them, yet shadows seemed to lurk at every bend. Twice, they witnessed groups of travelers huddled around fires, whispering rumors of bandit raids, though Orwyn suspected those bandits might be something else. When they finally neared Lannisport, Tishra shared her plan. "We should try to reach Maester Alfred discreetly, perhaps show him the chalice or some of the texts, see if he can confirm the language and the authenticity. If we gain his confidence, he might help us make the case to the lady or even the lord. But we must be cautious." Orwyn agreed. They returned to Casterly Rock just as snow flurries turned the world gray. No one questioned them much. After all, Tishra had forged the lady's seal for their journey, and the castle staff was used to comings and goings of various retainers. They slipped back into their daily routines, though both found it difficult to pretend normalcy. Late one evening, Orwyn mustered the courage to approach Maester Alfred in his study, stating he had something urgent to show him. Alfred, eyebrows raised, listened with skepticism as Orwyn carefully recounted a version of events, omitting some details, but emphasizing they had discovered relics that might connect an exiled Valyrian house to shadowy cult activities in Westeros. When Orwyn produced the silver chalice, Alfred's eyes widened. He took it in his wrinkled hands, studying the runes. "Where did you find this?" Alfred demanded, voice taut. Orwyn explained, haltingly, about a ruin in the Reach. He dared not say Darkspire by name. Alfred gave him a sharp look, clearly discerning that Orwyn withheld some specifics. The maester's eyes flicked over the inscriptions, his lips moving as he parsed the High Valyrian script. "He who drinks of blood shall bind the flame," he translated quietly. "This is a phrase I've seen in references to House Maegor's rumored cult of draconic summoning. But I never believed such a cult truly endured beyond the doom." His gaze pinned Orwyn. "You say you found actual adherents?" Orwyn nodded, pulse pounding. "They attacked us. They spoke of continuing the vow. There could be other enclaves throughout the realm." Alfred's face paled. "If this is true, gods, this is a threat to the peace of the kingdom." Tishra, who had been waiting outside, stepped in then, bowing slightly to the maester. "We want to share what we found with the Lannisters, if you think they'll heed it. We fear the realm is in danger from these hidden cults." The old maester rubbed his temples. "Lord Lannister is a proud man, not easily swayed by rumors. But if this chalice is genuine, if we can validate its age and the inscriptions, he might listen. Still, if word of this spreads, some will dismiss it as nonsense or accuse House Lannister of inventing a boogeyman to gain advantage." Tishra's jaw tightened. "We're aware, but we can't just do nothing." Alfred stood, pacing. He He studied Orwyn with a mix of confusion and grudging respect. "Never did I imagine you'd be embroiled in matters of such consequence, boy," he exhaled. "I'll do what I can. First, I must verify these inscriptions more thoroughly. Then, I'll request a private audience with the lady or lord. But mind you, if any word of this leaks prematurely, they could act rashly or silence the matter to prevent panic. We must handle this delicately." Orwyn and Tishara agreed. They turned over the relics to Alfred, except for a few scraps of the texts they'd kept hidden, just in case. For the next week, they waited in quiet tension, performing their usual tasks while the castle's daily life ground on. Alfred studied the chalice in secrecy, cross-referencing the runes with old tomes of Valyrian lore. At last, near the close of that week, Orwyn was summoned to Maester Alfred's chamber. Tishara, too, appeared at the door. They were led inside to find not only Alfred, but also the lady's brother, Ser Daemon Lannister, a stern man in his 40s who oversaw much of the house's martial affairs. Daemon eyed Orwyn and Tishara with suspicion, but Alfred vouched for their trustworthiness, recounting what they'd told him. Daemon examined the chalice with an impassive face. "If this is real, it's a problem that must be addressed. But House Lannister cannot act on half-verified rumors. We need tangible proof that these cults pose a genuine threat. Perhaps a small band of knights could be sent to this ruin you described. Gather further evidence." Orwyn glanced at Tishara, then mustered his courage. "My lord, we must be cautious. These cultists are dangerous, and there may be multiple enclaves. If you send knights openly, they might vanish or accomplish nothing." Daemon frowned. "So you suggest we do nothing?" "No," Tishara interjected. "We suggest that a more discreet approach might be best. If you truly want confirmation, we can lead a small scouting party, quiet and efficient. Or wait for the maesters to coordinate with Old Town. Either way, we must not expose ourselves until we know the full scope." Daemon drummed his fingers on the table, expression hard to read. "Very well. I shall consider this. For now, speak no further of it to anyone. Keep your heads down." He turned to Alfred. "Continue your research. I'll consult with my sister about how best to proceed. This may be a matter for the king's ear, or it may be better handled discreetly." With that, Orwyn and Tishara were dismissed. They left the chamber, hearts pounding, uncertain if they had gained an ally or stepped into a more dangerous game. Days turned into weeks. Winter bore down in earnest, blanketing the Westerlands with snow. No further summons came from Ser Daemon or the lady. Maester Alfred hinted that internal debates raged among the Lannisters about whether to press the issue or bury it. Orwyn worried that fear of scandal or distrust of the crown might lead them to hush the matter. Meanwhile, Tishara heard from a servant that some messenger had arrived from King's Landing, and the lady held a private council to discuss an unknown matter. Could it be related to the cult or something else entirely? In the quiet tension, Orwyn felt restless, caged. He spent long hours in the library, scouring old texts for any further mention of House Maegor, the Draconis Vow, or an Ash Wrm. One winter evening, as a howling wind rattled the castle's windows, Tishara joined him at a small reading desk. He read aloud from a partial chronicle describing the final days before the doom. Some spoke of an attempt by a coterie of sorcerer lords to harness the fires of the 14 flames in a single cataclysmic spell, meant to purge the weak from Valyria and usher in a new age. If House Maegor was among them, he trailed off, eyes drifting to Tishara. "It's all speculation, of course." She nodded, expression grave. "But speculation can change the fate of kingdoms if believed by those in power. We need more than speculation. We need something that can force the realm to heed the threat, like a living dragon conjured by these cultists or something equally undeniable." The idea chilled them both. A living dragon would be catastrophic. Yet if the cult's goal was truly to resurrect draconic might, they might not remain in the shadows forever. As if conjured by their dark musings, a summons arrived for them the very next morning. They were to report to Ser Daemon Lannister at dawn. Heart pounding, Orwyn hurried to the designated antechamber alongside Tishara. There, Daemon awaited them in a plain cloak, no armor. Oster taught with urgency. He spoke in a low voice. "We've received word of suspicious activity in a remote mountain village not far from the rock. Disappearances, strange chanting at night. The local lord requests help. Normally, we'd send a few soldiers, but given what you've told me, I suspect cult involvement. I'm riding out with a small, select group. You two will join us to identify any signs matching what you witnessed." Tishra's eyes narrowed. "You're taking this seriously?" Daemon's lip curled. "I don't enjoy chasing shadows, but if there's any chance these rumors link to your cult, we must act. Better to stamp it out close to home than let it fester." And so it was that Orwyn and Tishra found themselves once more on the road, this time in the company of 10 hardened Lannister men-at-arms led by Ser Daemon. The winter sky loomed over them, leaden and threatening snow. By midday, they reached a village nestled in a valley, where scrawny goats and sullen peasants eyed them warily. The local bailiff greeted Ser Daemon, explaining that 3 villagers had vanished in the past week. At night, eerie sounds echoed from the foothills. The bailiff suspected a gang of bandits or perhaps wildlings, an absurd notion this far south, but he admitted something felt unnatural. Ser Daemon and his men made camp near the village. Under the cover of darkness, guided by a trembling peasant who claimed to know where the chanting came from, they climbed a narrow path into the hills. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The wind howled around jagged rock outcroppings. Eventually, their guide pointed to a black maw in the mountainside, a cave. He refused to go further. Daemon beckoned Orwyn and Tishra to stay close. Torches lit, swords drawn, they crept inside. The passage sloped downward, the air growing stale. Soon they heard faint chanting. Tishra's eyes flicked to Orwyn, who nodded. It was the same ominous cadence they'd heard at Darkspire. Daemon signaled his men to spread out. They emerged into a cavern lit by flickering braziers. Hooded figures formed a circle around a makeshift altar. Upon that altar lay a terrified villager, bound and gagged. The cultists chanted in guttural tones, brandishing knives. The Lannister men charged, shouting war cries. Chaos erupted. Cultists turned, some drawing swords, others chanting faster as if trying to complete their rite. In the clash that followed, steel rang on steel. Daemon's knights were well trained, cutting down the robed figures with ruthless efficiency. But the cultists fought with mad fervor. One hurled a brazier to the ground, sending burning coals across the cavern floor. Another stabbed a knight in the thigh before being skewered. Through the melee, Tishra and Orwyn rushed toward the altar. They saw a tall figure in black snarling incantations, pressing a dagger to the captive's throat. Orwyn lunged with his torch, forcing the cultist back. Tishra dove in, slashing at the dagger arm. The cultist hissed in pain, dropping the blade. Daemon arrived a heartbeat later, bashing the cultist's head with his pommel. The figure collapsed, unconscious. Quickly, Tishra cut the captive's bonds, freeing him. All around, the battle raged. Flames danced across the cavern floor where coals ignited debris. A reek of burning flesh mingled with the tang of blood. The cultists shrieked, some in a language Orwyn didn't understand, others cursing in common tongue. The Lannister men pressed their advantage. Within moments, the cult circle was broken, their members either killed or captured. A few tried to flee into tunnels at the back of the cavern, but knights pursued. When the dust settled, Daemon ordered the fires extinguished. The surviving cultists, 2 unconscious, 1 badly wounded, were dragged to the center of the cavern. Tishra looked around, heart pounding. She spotted a crude altar stone etched with the same twisted Valyrian runes. A rusted chalice sat there, filled with something dark. One of the knights spat, "Devilry." Daemon nodded, face grim. "This is no ordinary band of criminals." He turned to Tishra and Orwyn. "I cannot deny it now. Your warnings were true." They managed to salvage a few parchments scattered around the altar. Even a quick glance revealed mention of Ash W. Aramis and a vow to the Keeper. Daemon's men eyed these items with superstitious dread, reluctant to handle them. But Orwyn's hands shook with a mixture of triumph and horror. Here was proof undeniable, direct. The cult was real, performing sacrifices in the name of resurrecting Valyria's lost power. After binding the surviving cultists, the party returned to the village by dawn, carrying them as prisoners. News spread quickly among the terrified peasants. The Lannister men tried to keep order, ensuring no vigilante mobs formed. Daemon planned to question the cultists, but the ones capable of speech only spat curses or laughed maniacally. One repeated a phrase in High Valyrian about the flame needing fresh blood. Daemon had them hauled off toward Casterly Rock, where dungeons and more skilled interrogators awaited. As the company set out, Orwyn rode alongside Daemon, who no longer regarded him with disdain. Daemon's tone was sober. "We'll present this evidence to my sister and the court. With living cultists, we can prove the threat. We'll likely send word to the crown and the citadel. The realm must be warned." Tishara let out a relieved sigh. "It's about time. Yet I fear this is only one cell among many." Daemon nodded. "Yes, we'll see what can be done. Wars are not fought only with swords, especially not wars against shadows. But at least we now know those shadows truly exist." They rode on through the swirling snow, a somber procession. Orwyn felt a strange calm settle over him. He had begun this journey as a lowly foundling, stumbling on a hidden scroll. Now he had helped reveal a conspiracy stretching back to old Valyria, a network of cults preserving House Maegor's dreadful rights. The doom of Valyria had not fully died with the freehold. Its embers smoldered in Westeros, awaiting kindling. Tishara, sensing his thoughts, guided her horse closer. She reached out to place a reassuring hand on his arm. "It won't be easy to stamp out these embers," she said. "No," Orwyn agreed, gazing across the bleak, snowy hills. "But at least now the truth won't be hidden. The vow that survived Valyria's doom is no longer secret, and that might be the first step in preventing an even greater disaster." He recalled the final words of that mad cultist at Darkspire. "You cannot stop the dragon's return." Perhaps they couldn't fully stop it, but they could try to shape the realm's response, exposing the lies and forbidding the darkest pacts. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but Orwyn no longer walked it alone. Tishara rode at his side, Ser Daemon's knights behind them, and the knowledge of these dire secrets carried forth to those with power enough to act. In the hush of falling snow, Orwyn closed his eyes for a moment, envisioning the spires of old Valyria crumbling into molten ruin, the screams of dragons devoured by flame. The doom might have claimed the freehold, yet it had birthed new threats half a world away. No empire, no house, no dream is ever entirely extinguished if fragments of its ambitions survive. In the centuries to come, the truth of old Valyria's final horror would echo through the halls of power in Westeros, if the realm was wise enough to listen. They reached Casterly Rock under skies of unrelenting gray, the snow drifting down with a quiet insistence that blanketed the ramparts and stung the faces of those entering the gates. The party had been gone only a handful of days, yet it felt far longer to Orwyn Hill. The sight of the massive lion banners overhead, damp with melting frost, should have consoled him, but no such comfort came. Even the fortress's familiar scents, heated stone, roasting meat, the tang of sea air rolling in from Lannisport, could not ease the knot in his chest. They brought their prisoners in beneath a hush. Ser Daemon Lannister had given explicit orders to keep the arrival discreet. The villagers' rescue and the cult's defeat remained known only to a handful of people. Most in the castle assumed this was an errand to quash bandits, typical winter outlaws. As Orwyn dismounted, stiff from the cold ride, he saw the confusion on the stablehands' faces when knights hauled in robed captives with bloody wounds. No explanation was offered, and the knights brushed aside questions with curt commands. Tishara Sand took the reins of her horse, a tall bay mare, and handed them off to a lad who hurried forward. She offered him a quiet thanks, then turned her attention to Ser Daemon. Snowflakes caught in her dark hair as she waited for him to give orders. Daemon was conversing with one of the men-at-arms, ensuring the cultists were locked in the deepest cells. Orwyn stepped up beside her, feeling the air throbbing with tension. They had evidence, living captives who might testify, if only in raving madness, that a hidden vow from old Valyria had spread into these mountains. Proof enough that the threat they'd warned of was no mere rumor. At last, Daemon beckoned them closer. "Maester Alfred will want to examine these prisoners," he said in a low voice, "and I suspect the lady will demand a full accounting. But we must tread carefully. I've no intention of letting wild talk spread through the castle or beyond. That would only cause panic." Tishra nodded. "These prisoners are dangerous. If we question them unwisely, they might do more harm than good." Daemon's mouth flattened in a thin line. "I'll see to their guards personally. For now, both of you get some rest. I'll send word when your presence is needed. Until then, keep your silence. No boasting about cults or Valyria." Orwyn dipped his head. He had no desire to boast about any of it. The echo of the chanting still clung to his memory, and the expressions on the faces of the knights who had fought alongside him. Most of them had never seen anything like that. Roving bandits or reavers, yes, but not hooded devotees chanting in a foreign tongue while trying to slit a terrified villager's throat as tribute to some non-existent dragon god. They parted ways. Orwyn trudged through half-frozen slush along the courtyard's perimeter, passing the stables and storerooms to reach the modest servant quarters. Tishra walked with him until their paths diverged. She was housed near the ladies' apartments as a companion. A flicker of concern passed between them as they exchanged farewells. Neither quite trusted the next step, but Tishra gave him a tight smile, eyes full of quiet determination. They had come this far. They wouldn't turn back now. Once alone, Orwyn found it almost impossible to sleep. Night had fallen, and the fortress quieted, but his mind swirled with the memory of the chanting cultists, the half-carved altar in that cavern. The inside of his eyelids burned with images of the writhing shapes on the stone, twisted serpents and runic letters. Some part of him almost regretted leaving High Pyre so many moons ago. Life had been simpler then. Miserable, perhaps, but lacking the burden of this secret knowledge. Yet fate had a way of snaring the unsuspecting in its web. At last, in the stillness before dawn, exhaustion overcame him. He dozed fitfully on his cramped pallet, dreaming of a mountain that split open to reveal a roiling mass of molten rock and scaled shapes crawling forth, shrieking in tongues older than the world. When he awoke, bathed in sweat despite the cold, the sky outside was dull gray, dawn hidden behind thick cloud. He half expected a knock on the door summoning him to some urgent meeting, but none came. He rose to go about menial tasks, trying not to draw attention. By midday, word arrived through a kitchen boy. Maester Alfred wished to see him and Tishra in his chambers. Orwyn quickly washed, changed into a cleaner tunic, and made his way there. He found Tishra already present, standing by the table where Alfred normally read. The maester himself was hunched over a thick tome, the silver chalice they had uncovered resting on a cloth before him. He looked up as Orwyn entered, beckoning him to close the door. Alfred set aside the book, exhaling in a raspy whisper. "Ser Daemon has told me of your latest encounter. Gods have mercy, you've brought back living zealots. They're in the dungeons now, raving half-coherently in at least 3 dialects, some of it reminiscent of High Valyrian. If I didn't trust Daemon's word, I might label all of you gullible." Tishra crossed her arms. "They were real enough with their knives." The maester pressed his lips thin. "Yes, and we cannot dismiss them as mere brigands adopting the trappings of Valyrian mysticism. What you've uncovered is far more elaborate. They speak repeatedly of the Keeper and the vow to birth the flame anew." He ran a hand over his balding head, his tone heavy with concern. "Daemon has taken steps to ensure none of the jailers speak of this outside the rock. But I doubt we can contain it forever." Orwyn felt the tension coil inside him. "Is the lady planning to inform the crown?" Alfred flicked his gaze at Tishra, then back to Orwyn, choosing his words carefully. "She is considering it. Lord Daemon leans toward summoning the crown's justiciars, possibly even calling for help from Targaryen loyalists or the king's men. But you must understand, The Lannisters value their autonomy. They dislike meddling from the Iron Throne unless it's absolutely necessary. It's more likely they'll try to gather more evidence, perhaps coordinate quietly with certain maesters at the Citadel. Tishara shook her head. In that time, the cult could spread further. How many more enclaves might attempt kidnappings or worse? Alfred pursed his lips. A fair point, but the lady is no fool. She fears that proclaiming a doomsday cult will lead to scorn, or worse, from rival houses. She also fears that if the king dismisses the matter, House Lannister's credibility, and by extension your credibility, could be damaged. They wish to proceed carefully. A hollow frustration settled in Orwyn's gut. So what do we do? You wait, Alfred said gently. For now, that is all. Ser Daemon has commanded that you remain in the castle, subject to his call. He may need your testimony when questioning the cultists further. If they speak in riddles, your experiences might help interpret them. Tishara's expression tightened. Very well, but we won't sit idle. Not when the realm is at risk. Alfred allowed himself a small, weary smile. I suspected as much. Be prudent, though. If the lady or her brother believe you're stirring panic, they'll clamp down. They appreciate your discoveries. Yes, but they also see you as a potential source of embarrassment if you speak out of turn. His words echoed in Orwyn's mind as he and Tishara left the chamber. Once in the corridor, Tishara let out a quiet hiss of frustration. Politics. Always politics. Meanwhile, more innocents could be dragged onto altars somewhere in these hills. She looked at Orwyn, her eyes shining with a fierce light. We need to glean what we can from these cultists. Even if we can't publicly question them, maybe there's a way to speak to them in the dungeons. Sometimes a prisoner will talk more freely if they're not faced with a lord or a maester. Orwyn swallowed. The thought of sneaking into the dungeon to confront one of those raving zealots unsettled him, but her logic was sound. They might glean more about the vow, the keeper, or places where the cult thrived. Every scrap of knowledge counted. All right, he said quietly, but we have to be cautious. That same night, when the corridor torches sputtered in their sconces and most of the guards were distracted by the bitter cold, Tishara convinced a sympathetic squire to let them descend to the dungeons on the pretense of delivering a message from Maester Alfred. Orwyn couldn't help but marvel at her audacity and skill with words. Before long, they stood before the heavy iron doors leading to the dim labyrinth beneath Casterly Rock. The cold seemed to deepen below ground. Water dripped from cracks in the stone, forming puddles on the floor. Torchlight cast shifting shadows along the passage. A pair of Lannister guards in battered cloaks stood watch, yawning from the lateness of the hour. Tishara flashed a small parchment that bore the Maester's seal, claiming it authorized them to check on the prisoners. The guards, too weary and cold to question thoroughly, unbarred the door. Inside, the gloom thickened. The corridor split left and right, each leading to cells carved into the rock's foundation. Orwyn remembered delivering messages here in the past, far less dramatic ones, but still enough to know it was a forbidding place. The air stank of damp straw, old sweat, and fear. He held a torch in front of him, the glow revealing row after row of stout wooden doors bound by iron. Most were empty, or so it seemed, for no voices called out. Then, faintly, he heard a distant muttering that sounded like singing or chanting. Tishara led the way, her boots soft on the wet stone. She paused at a cell from which that low voice issued. Carefully, she lifted the bar on a narrow shutter in the door's center, revealing a small window set with iron bars. Orwyn held the torch high so they could see within. A man crouched on the straw-strewn floor, rocking back and forth. His hair was matted with dried blood, one of the cultists captured in the cavern. His thin lips moved incessantly, forming words Orwyn could barely make out. High Valyrian or a debased variant. Every so often, the man would jerk his head as if beset by an unseen torment. Tishara cleared her throat softly. "You there," she said in a commanding whisper. "Look at me." He went on muttering, ignoring her. She glanced at Orwyn, who nodded. He stepped closer to the opening, speaking in the handful of Valyrian words he knew. Dracarys? Valonqar? Zobri? They were disjointed phrases, but the man's reaction was immediate. He looked up sharply, eyes wide and bloodshot. "Zobri," the cultist echoed, voice hoarse. "Blood, fire, it is all undone. You can't keep it sealed in darkness. The vow calls to us." Tishara gripped the bars. "Who holds the vow? How far does it reach? Tell us." The cultist let out a wheezing laugh. "Too late. You may chain my body, but the vow has taken root in many. The serpent shall coil around your great lords, your kingdoms, until it is too late. A new flame shall be born, wreathed in blood. The ash wyrms will rise. Valyria's children are not done with this world." A chill scurried down Orwyn's spine at the mention of ash wyrms. He recalled references to such beasts in the texts at Darkspire, some twisted version of dragons, perhaps, or an archaic name for the same monstrous being. "Who is the keeper?" he pressed. "Is there someone leading you?" The man's eyes flickered with a strange, unholy light. "The keeper dwells where the old flame touches the new, where the earth's blood seeps up in the west. She is born of the old line." He bared his teeth. "A scion of Maegor, a rightful heir to the fire that was stolen by the Targaryens. One day soon, she shall be revealed." Tishara's lips parted, shock visible in her expression. "A living descendant of House Maegor?" she murmured. "That's impossible. The doom was centuries ago." The cultist gave a ragged grin. "What is the doom but a test of fire? Bloodlines can be preserved, or begun anew. Fire forges, does it not?" Then he let out a sudden wail, grabbing at his hair. "It calls to me even here, beneath these cursed stones. The vow is not broken." He began chanting again, rocking violently. Seeing no further coherence, Tishara closed the shutter. The man's voice continued in muffled tone from the other side. They exchanged a troubled glance. The notion that a Maegor scion, someone claiming direct descent, lived in secret was both staggering and appalling. The Targaryens had always been known as the sole survivors of Valyria's Dragonlord families, along with a few lesser branches like Valerion and Celtigar. But House Maegor had been rumored to dabble in sorceries even more horrific than the standard Valyrian cruelty. Could one scion truly have escaped, or had a line parted from the main branch long before the doom? Soft footsteps echoed along the corridor. Tishara motioned for silence, and they quickly stepped away from the cell door. A guard appeared, carrying a sputtering lantern. He blinked at them in surprise, then recognized the forged seal. "All well?" he asked, raising the lantern to see them better. Orwyn nodded, schooling his features. "We were tasked by Maester Alfred to examine the prisoner. We're nearly done." The guard gave a grimace. "Best you not get too close. They're all mad as hungry dogs." He scratched his unshaven chin. "But I'd rather face a dog than a demon worshipper." With a polite shrug, Tishara thanked him, and they left before the man grew suspicious. Back upstairs, with the torches behind them, they emerged into the corridor near the Maester's tower. The difference in warmth and relative brightness felt jarring, as though they'd surfaced from a nightmare. Tishara drew Orwyn aside, voice low and urgent. "Did you hear what he said about the Keeper? Someone from House Maegor? If that's true, if there truly is a living lineage, it changes everything." Orwyn's heart pounded. Think of what it means. The Targaryens built their rule on being the sole heirs of the Dragonlords, at least the only ones who made it across the sea. If there's another scion, especially one rumored to practice monstrous sorcery, that's a threat to the crown as much as to the rest of the realm. Tishara nodded grimly. The question is how many Westerosi lords might be secretly in league with such a figure, or seduced by promises of draconic power. If we learned anything at High Pyre and Darkspire, it's that desperation and ambition can drive even proud houses to secret deals. Exhaustion tugged at Orwyn. "We should tell Alfred what the cultists said. It might at least guide his research. And perhaps Ser Daemon, though we must choose our words carefully." They parted ways briefly, each returning to their quarters to snatch whatever rest they could before confronting the day's duties. Orwyn felt a weight on his mind that no amount of sleep could lift. The possibility that somewhere in the west or beyond, a hidden bloodline of Maegor endured. It was more than he'd bargained for when he first found that sealed scroll. Yet here he was, entangled in a story of ancient heresies, mightier than any foundling stableboy's imagination. That dawn was bleak, the sun just a pale smear behind iron clouds. Ice clung to the castle walls. Orwyn resumed his chores mechanically, delivering messages and fetching items for the servants' halls. He recognized the hush in the corridors, the sense that something loomed over the entire fortress. Word traveled, even if unspoken. Knights and guards exchanged uneasy looks. The men who had accompanied Daemon to the cavern likely whispered among themselves about the horrors they'd seen. Rumors were beginning to swirl, no doubt. One stable hand asked Orwyn in hushed tones if it was true the bandits prayed to fire demons. Orwyn feigned ignorance. In the middle of the day, Tishera found him near the library antechamber, beckoning him urgently. Her cheeks were flushed, her breath short. "Ser Daemon wants us," she managed. "He's in the audience chamber with the lady. Maester Alfred, too." Orwyn's mouth went dry. "They want us there?" She nodded, grabbing his sleeve. "Hurry." They navigated the winding corridors, each torch bracket flaring as they passed. The audience chamber was a stately hall perched on an upper level, though overshadowed in winter gloom. A large hearth at the far end crackled with logs, but Orwyn felt no warmth. Before the dais where the Lady of the Rock would normally sit, he saw Ser Daemon standing alongside her. She was a woman of regal bearing, her hair caught in a net of gold, face set in a mask of stone. Maester Alfred waited near them, along with a figure Orwyn did not know. A tall man dressed in traveling leathers, a short cloak pinned at the shoulder. He had brown hair streaked with silver, a lined face that suggested many years on the road. A huntsman or perhaps a courier. His eyes flicked to Tishera and Orwyn as they entered, curiosity and wariness in his gaze. "Come forward," Ser Daemon said, beckoning them in a clipped tone. Orwyn took a breath, stepping onto the mosaic floor. Tishera followed, head high. The lady spoke first, her voice carrying a quiet authority that could hush a rowdy feast hall. "We've heard from Ser Daemon the details of your expedition, the capture of these cultists. Maester Alfred tells us you played a significant role in uncovering their vile practices. Is that true?" Orwyn bowed his head, nerves taut. "Yes, my lady. We only did what seemed necessary." She studied him intently. "And you first stumbled upon evidence of such an organization while searching old records?" "More or less, my lady," Tishera interjected. "It's been a chain of discoveries." Orwyn found a curious scroll that referenced a hidden vow, leading us to investigate further. We sought out rumored sites where exiled Valyrians once practiced sorcery. The lady's composure did not waver, though her knuckles pressed white against the arms of her seat. "Then you both have a sense of how widespread this threat may be." "Daemon believes it could be significant. So do I. We cannot allow this rot to take hold in the Westerlands. Already, it has touched a village on our doorstep." Ser Daemon cleared his throat. "We have a visitor, as you can see." He gestured to the tall man in traveling leathers, "who bears a message from the crown. Word reached King's Landing of strange happenings in the west, possibly from travelers' tales or else from some unguarded tongue. This messenger, Lord Rhaemar Conklin, has come to inquire on behalf of the Hand. We face a difficult choice. Do we share fully what we know, or do we keep certain details hidden?" Tishera's eyes flicked to the man, Lord Rhaemar, and he gave a curt nod. He carried himself with the confidence of one used to delivering royal inquiries. "Indeed, my lady. The crown has heard unsettling rumors of dark rites in these mountains. The Hand is concerned for the realm's stability. He wonders if any threat might require the king's justice." The lady pursed her lips. "We appreciate the king's concern, but House Lannister handles its own affairs. We have the situation well in hand, though we investigate its scope." Rhaemar cocked his head. "The king's reach extends over all the 7 kingdoms, my lady. If dark sorcery is at play, it concerns all. Yet the crown respects your domain. It does not intrude lightly." Maester Alfred stepped in gently, addressing Rhaemar. "We have preliminary evidence suggesting a network of heretical Valyrian cultists scattered in remote areas. They worship the memory of old Valyria, even claiming a line that predates the Targaryens' arrival. But we have no proof of any real dragon, only the mad ravings of zealots." He glanced at Orwyn and Tishera. "Their involvement has been crucial in uncovering these enclaves. They can confirm the authenticity of certain relics we found." Rhaemar considered them, interest sparking in his eyes. "Relics, you say?" Ser Daemon offered a quick, tight smile. "We do not display them for all to see. Our approach is cautious. Right now, we want to ascertain whether this movement is truly a threat to the Iron Throne or just a handful of lunatics. My sister and I weigh the merits of summoning royal assistance or dealing with it privately." Rhaemar lifted a brow. "I can only relay what I see and learn to the hand, my lord. He will decide how best to advise his grace. If you possess tangible evidence, I'd like to examine it." Orwyn could almost see the lady's reluctance, but at length she said, "Very well. Maester, show him the chalice, the blade, the texts under careful guard. Lord Rhaemar's eyes only. He must understand we have not conjured a fantasy. And if it convinces him we face a genuine threat, we will consider requesting further help from King's Landing." Rhaemar inclined his head in gratitude. "Of course, my lady." The lady shifted her gaze to Tishera and Orwyn. "And you too, your knowledge is valuable, but remain discreet. Do not speak to others in the castle about these matters. This is a delicate situation, and rumors can cause harm." Tishera bowed, pressing a hand to her chest. "Yes, my lady," Orwyn echoed her. With that, they were dismissed. Ser Daemon stayed behind, presumably to discuss how best to handle the details with Rhaemar. Outside the chamber, Tishera released a breath. "So the crown already caught wind. That was fast." Orwyn nodded, thoughts whirling. "Let's hope it doesn't lead to open conflict. If the crown decides the West harbors traitorous dragon worshippers, it could provoke a heavy-handed response. Then again, if the crown chooses to ignore the threat, the cult might spread unchecked." They parted in the corridor, promising to convene later. True to her resourceful nature, Tishera intended to mingle discreetly among courtiers, gleaning what she could about this Lord Rhaemar Conklin's background and allegiances. Orwyn returned to the servants' wing, offering to help the kitchens in a vain attempt to occupy his restless energy. Kneading dough and chopping onions offered little respite. His mind strayed constantly to the cult's words. The Keeper, House Maegor, a vow sealed in blood. That evening, Tishera caught up to him in a deserted hallway near the stables, her face set with determination. She related whispers she'd picked up. Rhaemar was a minor lord from the Crownlands, known for a neutral stance in politics. He served the hand loyally, delivering dispatches and investigating local disturbances. It seemed he was no great threat personally, nor an ambitious manipulator. He'd simply come to gather facts and report them. That left the question of what the Hand in King's Landing would do with any such report. While they murmured, Orwyn spied a figure at the far end of the corridor, a tall shape slipping around a corner. He froze, uncertain if they'd been overheard. Tishera narrowed her eyes. They waited a tense moment, but no one appeared. At last, they decided to break off, returning to their chambers. Yet the sense of eyes upon them grew in the coming days. Orwyn felt the prickle of scrutiny whenever he crossed the courtyard. The Lannisters had them under watch, no doubt, but it felt like something else, too, like a silent presence waiting in the corners. He couldn't dismiss the memory of how the cult at Darkspire had attacked so suddenly from the shadows. Meanwhile, Lord Rhaemar spent long hours in discussion with Maester Alfred, examining the chalice, the sword, and the partial scrolls. Guards reported that Rhaemar's face grew graver with each passing day. Orwyn caught a glimpse of him once, emerging from the Maester's library with an ashen expression. He clearly hadn't expected to find such solid evidence of a Valyrian-based conspiracy. On the third day after Rhaemar's arrival, Tishera found Orwyn again with news. Rhaemar departs tomorrow for King's Landing. Ser Daemon and the lady apparently decided it's best to brief the crown swiftly. They want us to remain here. Only Rhaemar and a handful of knights will ride out." Orwyn felt a confusing mixture of relief and apprehension. "So the matter is in the king's hands?" Tishara folded her arms. "Yes, but what next? We remain at the rock, waiting. The lady may want to root out any enclaves in her territory, but we still don't know where else the cult lurks." She had a point. Orwyn's mind flicked to the references in the text to Darksong Caverns in the Vale, a black crypt beneath Storm's End, plus other possible enclaves. The realm was wide, and any one of those places might harbor rituals like the ones they'd witnessed. That night, lying awake on his pallet, he wondered if they should remain in the West or strike out again on their own. Yet he'd given his word to Daemon to stay, and they needed the Lannisters' resources to make any real difference. The next morning's sky remained overcast, the promise of further snow in the air. Orwyn rose early, dressing in a thicker cloak. He lingered in the courtyard, watching as Lord Rhaemar and his small retinue of knights prepared to depart. They loaded their horses with provisions, the castle steward ensuring everything was in order. Daemon oversaw the final details. Alfred hovered nearby, looking troubled. Tishara joined Orwyn at the courtyard's edge, silent as she took in the scene. When Rhaemar swung into the saddle, he caught sight of the two of them. With a small nudge of his horse, he rode closer. "Orwyn Hill and Tishara Sand, I take it?" he asked politely, though he'd already identified them in the audience chamber. "I've heard of your part in unearthing these secrets. For what it's worth, I believe you saved more lives than you know." Tishara inclined her head. "We only hope the crown takes this threat seriously, my lord." Rhaemar offered a grim nod. "After what I've seen, there can be no doubt. The evidence is compelling. The Hand will want to learn if these enclaves extend beyond the West. If so, it's a matter for the entire realm. I will do my utmost to ensure the king understands." His eyes flicked toward the portcullis. "Farewell to you both. May the Seven keep you." With that, he turned his horse, and the retinue clattered out into the cold morning. Daemon and Alfred lingered a moment, exchanging words, before heading indoors. Orwyn and Tishara watched the riders vanish through the gate, uncertain whether to feel hopeful or fearful. If the Iron Throne recognized the scope of the cult, it might unify the realm in stamping it out, or it might provoke chaos if unscrupulous houses tried to harness the cult for their own ends, or if the Targaryens themselves took it as a personal challenge to their monopoly on dragons. Through that day and the ones that followed, an uneasy lull settled over Casterly Rock. The captive cultists remained locked deep in the dungeons, while Ser Daemon tried to glean more from them. Some had died of their wounds. The survivors spoke only in half-coherent riddles. Tishara learned from a guard that one prisoner babbled about the Black Basalt Spire and an upcoming convergence under a moon of blood, but discerning a timeline or location from that was impossible. During these days, Orwyn found himself drawn back to the scroll he had stolen from the Rock's archives. A lifetime ago, it seemed, he had transcribed parts of it, though much remained unclear. He spent hours in the library, cross-referencing older tomes of High Valyrian, trying to decipher more of the vow's details. It was a slow, painstaking process, and he often had to beg or barter for glimpses of texts that were ordinarily reserved for the maester's eyes. Alfred, preoccupied with the captives and the ladies' inquiries, had little time to assist. Tishara occasionally joined him, scanning the spidery script. Her knowledge of languages was limited, but she grasped the repeated references to Serpent of the West and Bloodbound Flame. The vow had the markings of a long-form ritual that demanded not just sacrifice but the channeling of energy from certain volcanic or geothermal sites. She recalled how High Pyre had possessed a natural heat beneath it, and the rumors of sulfur vents. They began to wonder if the cult sought out specific places in the world where the land's fire rose close to the surface. Could that be the Earth's blood the cultist mentioned? It gnawed at Orwyn that they still had no direct lead on the Keeper. They had a handful of references, a swirl of cryptic phrases. And then there was that monstrous possibility that the Keeper herself or himself, though the cultist had used she, might be a genuine descendant of Maegor. If the vow demanded a figure of Dragonlord blood, that might explain why the cult had endured so long. always searching for or grooming that lost scion, generation after generation. One afternoon, while Orwyn pored over a Valyrian phrasebook, Tishara startled him by slamming her hand on the table. "Wait!" she whispered, eyes bright. "I recall reading something about a woman who claimed to be a Maegor years ago. Some outcast who turned up in Volantis, stirring unrest. Could it be connected?" Orwyn frowned. "Volantis is far across the narrow sea. The cult might stretch that far, but let me think," she continued. "There was a rumor that she wore a pendant shaped like a serpent devouring its tail, and that she told wild tales of an unbroken line from old Valyria. But everyone dismissed her as a charlatan. Yet the cult symbol is very like that serpent motif we saw on the scroll and the basin at High Pyre." Tishara grew more excited. If she was real, maybe she or her offspring ended up in Westeros, forging alliances with gullible lords. They talked it through until their heads ached, concluding only that the rumor might add one more layer to the labyrinth. If this rumored woman from Volantis had indeed been part of the Maegor line, the timeline could match the possibility of a direct descendant still alive. And if that scion now called herself the Keeper, it meant the vow had deep roots spanning both Essos and Westeros. That evening, they tried to bring their speculation to Maester Alfred. He listened, eyes drooping from weariness, then sighed. "If you had proof, it would be one thing, but a rumor from across the sea." He rubbed his brow. "I don't dismiss it outright. Perhaps when the Crown's response arrives, we'll have more resources to investigate. Until then, do not get lost in speculation. We need something concrete." Orwyn left that conversation disheartened, feeling as though each new clue floated just out of reach. Tishara was no less frustrated, but she maintained her resolve. If an opportunity arose, they would chase it. For now, they were effectively waiting for news from King's Landing, waiting for the cultists to reveal more, waiting for the lady or daemon to act. The waiting ended on a night when the winter wind howled across the battlements like a living thing. Orwyn was jolted awake by hurried footsteps outside his chamber door. He heard distant shouts echoing through the corridor. Alarmed, he stumbled to his feet, pulled on a cloak, and rushed out. A guard nearly barreled into him, panting. "Fire!" The guard spat. "In the archives below the Maester's tower. It's spreading fast." Orwyn's heart lurched. He bolted past the guard, racing to the dimly lit spiral stair that led down to the older storerooms where he had once discovered that sealed scroll. Smoke already wafted up the steps. A handful of servants scrambled with buckets of water, though in the midst of winter that was no easy remedy. The castle's well was partly frozen, and the wooden buckets in use were pitifully few. Orwyn descended, choking on the stench of burning parchment. At the landing, flames danced along the walls. Smoke swirled in thick plumes. Tishara was there, coughing as she tried to direct a pair of stable boys who had come to help. Why were flinging water onto the blaze, but it was hopeless. The old scroll racks and wooden shelves had caught like tinder. Sparks flew with each crash of falling beams. Maester Alfred stood further back, tears in his eyes as he watched centuries of records vanish into fire. This was no accident. He rasped at Orwyn, voice shaking with anger and grief. The flames started in 3 different corners, all at once. Someone said it. Orwyn felt a surge of dread. Someone had deliberately targeted the archives, likely the older, more obscure sections containing references to Valyria and the cult. Tishara tried to approach the heart of the blaze, but a falling timber nearly took her head. She staggered back, cursing. More guards arrived, but there was little they could do beyond contain the spread to this one area. The heat was intense, sweat beading on every brow despite the frigid air. After what felt like an eternity, the men succeeded in isolating the flames, ripping down sections of tapestries and battered shelves to prevent the fire's advance. They used wet blankets, thrown from above, to smother the outskirts of the blaze. Yet the central storeroom, and many of its scrolls, remained a smoking ruin. Cinders floated in the darkness like hateful fireflies. Orwyn stood, numb, gazing at the blackened remains. All around him, people coughed and spat, eyes stinging from smoke. Tishra joined him, face smeared with soot. They wanted to destroy the records, she said in a hollow voice. Any references to House Maegor, the Vow, the old families. We found enough. They must want to erase the rest. Orwyn stared at the charred racks. If we'd had more time, we might have gleaned even more knowledge here. Now it's gone. The only evidence left is what we took, and what the cult holds in their enclaves. Maester Alfred limped closer, a cloth pressed to his mouth. He sounded furious and heartsick. All that history gone. I only turned in for the night a short while ago. When I smelled smoke, I rushed down, but it was already too late. A guard approached, shaking his head. No sign of an intruder, but we found a side door forced open. Likely they fled in the chaos. Alfred looked stricken. Tishra exchanged a grim glance with Orwyn. The cult had infiltrated the very heart of Casterly Rock to destroy records that might expose their secrets. If they could do that, how far did their influence reach? Any illusions of safety behind these thick walls were shattered. Within the hour, Ser Daemon arrived, having been roused from his bed. Clad in a hastily donned cloak, he stood surveying the remains with clenched fists. The lady soon followed, wearing a heavy fur robe over her night attire. Her expression was thunderous. She asked sharp questions of the guards, demanded thorough searches, but the culprit was gone. A handful of riders were dispatched to comb the roads. With the snow still falling, tracks might be visible, but success was hardly assured. Afterward, in the cold gloom of pre-dawn, Daemon gathered Orwyn, Tishra, and Alfred in a small side room away from prying ears. A single brazier provided meager warmth. Daemon's eyes, lit by the flickering coals, were hard as iron. "This is a calculated strike," he said, "and it proves the cult's infiltration. Someone with knowledge of these halls aided the arsonist. There must be a spy within our walls. Someone who knew precisely where to go and how to slip away." Alfred trembled with rage. "I had many valuable tomes stored there, not just on Valyria, but that portion was particularly targeted. They destroyed anything referencing lesser Dragonlord lines. Decades of my life's work, gone." Tishra placed a hand on the maester's shoulder. "We still have the relics, and the texts from Darkspire, the chalice, the sword. They can't burn what we carry in our memories." Orwyn nodded. "But this means the cult won't hesitate to strike again. They've revealed they have the means to breach the rock. Perhaps a well-placed servant is one of them, or a lesser knight, or even—" He hesitated, not wanting to cast suspicion blindly, but Daemon's grim nod showed he understood. "I'll increase security. Every entrance will be guarded night and day," Daemon vowed. "We'll question the staff discreetly, but we can't chain up everyone. That leaves us vulnerable." Alfred coughed into his cloth, then lowered it. "There may be an alternative. If we cannot guarantee security for our research here, we might send certain items to Old Town or King's Landing, where more resources can protect them." Tishra and Orwyn exchanged a look. Daemon pressed a hand to his brow, as if warding off a headache. "Lord Raymar's departure was timely. At least he carries proof. But yes, perhaps we should consider sending you, Alfred, with the relics to the Citadel for safekeeping. Or we coordinate with the Crown's men to arrange a secure escort." Alfred started to speak, but Tishra spoke first. "What about us? We can't sit idle. If the cult is burning archives and kidnapping people in the mountains, I'd like to help root them out." Ser Daemon studied her, then turned his gaze to Orwyn. "And you? Do you feel the same?" Orwyn recalled the boy he'd once been, dwarfed by the rock's towering walls, overlooked by all. Now, though fear still swirled in him, he recognized a purpose he couldn't deny. "Yes," he said quietly. "We've come too far to do nothing." Daemon nodded. "The lady and I have decided we can't wait for King's Landing to respond. We'll dispatch small squads to investigate rumored enclaves throughout the Westerlands. The objective is to find any sign of cult gatherings, stamp them out, or bring back prisoners for questioning. This may risk further infiltration, but we can't cower behind our gates." He shifted his stance. "I was about to propose you two join one such squad. But I warn you, these missions will be dangerous. More so than any you've undertaken. The cult won't be caught off guard again. Tishara lifted her chin. We're not afraid. Orwyn wished he felt the same confidence, but he nodded in agreement. We'll go. Where do we start? Damon paced beside the brazier, casting a long shadow. We have fresh rumors from the far western shore, near Case. A fisherman claimed he saw lights in a sea cave at night and heard chanting echo across the water. He spoke of shapes dancing around what looked like an altar. Normally, I'd ignore such a tale, but now... He glanced at them. If you can confirm a cult presence and eliminate it, that would be a blow in our favor. I'll assign a small contingent of loyal men, those who fought beside us in the mountain village. Maester Alfred coughed again, eyes watering from the smoke. We'll keep an organized record of your findings, whatever you learn. But be wary. If the cult has local allies, they may try to misdirect or ambush you. Tishara managed a faint smile. We've had practice being wary. Thus it was settled. In the chaos following the archive fire, as the castle staff worked to salvage what little remained, Orwyn and Tishara prepared for a covert journey to the western shores. Ser Damon selected 6 men-at-arms who'd proven themselves reliable and courageous. They would travel light, posing as a band of guards escorting a courier to Case. The official story: they bore a private letter from Lady Lannister to the local reeve. In truth, they aimed to investigate the rumored sea cave at night. 2 days later, they rode westward under a sky that threatened fresh snow. They followed winding roads that cut through rocky hills, passing few travelers aside from the occasional merchant cart. The men Damon had chosen, Horace, Mandon, Garrett, Roderick, Lyle, and Artha, rode with watchful discipline. They had faced the cult once, in the cavern near that mountain village, and it had left them sober and alert. Orwyn rode near Tishara, a quiet tension thrumming in his veins. Though he wore only a simple brigandine and carried a short sword he barely knew how to use, he felt more prepared than he had at Darkspire. Tishara had her bow slung across her back, a quiver of arrows at her hip, along with her trusty dagger. The men-at-arms were each armed with sword and shield, some with crossbows. Quiet conversation passed among them, mostly about the cold or the state of the roads. None of them spoke openly of what they might find near Case. On the 4th day, they approached the coastline. The sea stretched out before them, a slate-gray expanse broken by whitecaps. Case was a modest port, overshadowed by Lannisport's splendor, but it served the local fisherfolk and occasional traders. They arrived at dusk, the sky tinged with bruise-colored clouds. After stabling their horses at an inn, they split up to gather information discreetly. Horace and Garrett roamed the docks, Tishara and Orwyn the taverns, while Mandon remained behind to guard their gear. In a dimly lit tavern called the Sea's Sorrow, Orwyn and Tishara ordered watered ale and kept their ears open. The place was crowded with fishermen and laborers who smacked of salt and sweat, but the hush of winter had tempered some of the rowdiness. Orwyn forced himself to appear casual, listening to bits of conversation. After an hour, Tishara nudged him subtly and tilted her head toward a corner where an older fisherman with a grizzled beard sat alone, nursing a cup. He looked half in his cups already. They approached, offering to buy him another drink if he would share local news. The fisherman eyed them warily, but after slurping the free ale, his tongue loosened. He introduced himself as Lomar. Tishara, ever the deft conversationalist, steered him toward talk of odd happenings along the coast. Lomar grumbled. I heard talk of a cave up north near the cliffs. People say fires glow inside, though how a fire stays lit in a sea cave is a mystery. He drained his cup. Old superstition. Some say it's pirates. Others say it's ghosts. Me, I saw a boat moored there once, late at night. Didn't look like no ordinary fishing vessel. Had a figurehead shaped like a serpent. Tishara's gaze flicked to Orwyn. A serpent, you say? Any chance you saw who crewed it? Lomar shrugged. Nah, I kept my distance. Didn't want trouble. But I heard chanting echoing across the water. Low, rumbling. Sent a chill down my spine. Next day, the boat was gone. Haven't seen it since. but folks still claim they spy lights in that cave from time to time. Orwyn felt gooseflesh rise on his arms. And this is a day's sail from Case? Less if the wind's right, or a half-day ride by land if you climb the cliffs carefully. It's near the cove called Widow's Wail, so named because the waves crash fierce there, like a woman's lament. He chuckled bitterly. Any soul foolish enough to poke around those rocks might end up battered to death. Even the tide is tricky. Tishara pressed gently. Would you show us where? He grimaced. No, lass, not me. I'm too old for messing with devils or pirates. I can point you to the path, though, if you're set on it. Just promise if you find anything unnatural, you give it wide berth. Tishara gave a soft laugh that held no real mirth. We'll be careful. They paid him a few coppers for his troubles, gleaning directions to a narrow trail that wound along the cliffs. The fishermen swore that if they watched carefully, they would see an opening in the rock face at low tide. They reported this to Horace and Garrett, who had gathered similar rumors on the docks. Talk of a serpent-headed skiff, glimpsed once or twice by smugglers. None had dared approach. That was enough to firm their resolve. After a night's rest in Case, they set out at dawn, heading north along the rocky coastline. The wind whipped across their faces, tangling hair and stinging eyes. Gulls circled overhead, mewling. By midday, they reached a jagged stretch of cliffs that dropped into the churning sea below. Waves crashed with a thunderous roar, spraying foam. The men tethered their horses to a cluster of scrubby trees, unwilling to risk them on the narrow path. Lyle, the scout among them, led the way. They walked single file along a precarious trail that wound around boulders and near vertical slopes. The sound of the surf echoed, magnified by the rocky walls. Occasionally, a distant gull's cry punctuated the steady roar. At last, they came to a flatter shelf of stone with a partial overhang above. Below them, the tide was receding, revealing a dark gash in the cliff face. Seaweed draped the rocks like limp banners. Even from above, Orwyn felt a surge of foreboding. Tishara crouched, peering down. The men-at-arms exchanged uneasy glances. "Looks like the place," Tishara said grimly. Horace frowned at the steep descent. "We'll have to climb carefully, not all of us at once. If there's anyone inside, they'll hear us on these rocks." Mandan adjusted his shield. "We should wait until the waves have gone out further." The fisherman said the tide's tricky. "If we get trapped by a sudden surge, we'll be done for." Garrett and Roderick stood watch while the rest hunkered under the overhang. They gnawed dried meat and drank cold water, waiting for the tide to reach its lowest point. Orwyn's nerves felt stretched. He tried not to envision an ambush below, but the memory of Dark Spire, of cultists lurking in the gloom, refused to leave him. When at last the tide receded enough to reveal slippery rocks leading to the cave's entrance, Horace led the way down. The men followed in pairs, stepping gingerly to avoid sudden slides. Tishara was nimble as a cat, her boots finding secure footholds. Orwyn struggled a bit, cursing under his breath each time he nearly lost balance. The sea hissed around them, and gulls circled above, as if anticipating a feast. They reached the cave mouth, which was wide enough for 4 men abreast. The rock overhead dripped with briny water. Seaweed clung to the entrance. Inside, the dimness beckoned. A faint smell of smoke or tallow wafted out. Orwyn exchanged an anxious glance with Tishara. That smell hinted at torchlight or lamps used recently. Horace motioned for silence. They readied their weapons. Tishara knocked an arrow. Orwyn drew his short sword. The men-at-arms formed a shielded front, creeping inward. The sound of dripping water echoed in the gloom. A few steps in, their eyes adjusted to the low light. Fissures in the cave's ceiling admitted narrow shafts of daylight. Here and there, puddles glistened. The ground felt slick, forcing them to watch each step. They heard a whisper of movement deeper inside. Then, abruptly, torchlight flared, revealing a figure standing on a rocky ledge. A woman in a hooded cloak. She thrust her torch into the air and shrieked something that might have been a signal. At once, other torches ignited along the cavern walls, at least 6, maybe more, held by robed figures. Their voices rose in a low chant. The men-at-arms advanced, forming a half-circle. "In the name of House Lannister," Horys bellowed, "lay down your arms and surrender." The chanting escalated. The robed figures didn't flee. Instead, two of them pulled out crossbows, loosing bolts at the intruders. One grazed Lyle's shield. Another clattered off the rock, narrowly missing Mandan. Tishara sprang forward, arrow readied, loosing a shot that took one crossbowman in the shoulder. He howled and staggered back. Orwyn's heart thudded. He tried to keep to the side, sword clutched in clammy hands. The robed woman on the ledge shouted words in High Valyrian that Orwyn only partly recognized. References to blood, flame, the serpent that devours. Another pair of cultists rushed forward with curved blades, screaming in rage. What followed was a tangle of chaos. The clash of steel reverberated off the cavern walls. The swirl of torches cast wild shadows, making it hard to see where the rock ended and the robed figures began. Orwyn parried a slash from one cultist, nearly losing his grip. The impact jolted his arms. The cultist hissed, pressing the attack. Orwyn stumbled on the slick stone, but Tishara's arrow whistled past, striking the assailant's flank. He dropped, shrieking. Orwyn barely had time to gasp his thanks before two more cultists rushed in. Horys and Garrett fought shoulder to shoulder, blocking sword thrusts with their shields. Roderick and Artha advanced on the crossbow-wielding cultists, forcing them to drop their weapons and draw daggers. The chanting had shifted into a dissonant wail. Orwyn glimpsed the woman on the ledge tossing some powder onto a brazier. Bright orange sparks erupted, filling the air with a pungent, sulphurous reek. One cultist lunged at Orwyn with a dagger. Orwyn managed to sidestep, swinging clumsily. He caught the man's arm, slicing through cloth and flesh. The cultist yelled in pain, but that spurred him on. He slammed into Orwyn, sending them both to the ground in a tangle. Orwyn's head struck the stone, stars bursting in his vision. He tasted blood. The cultist's dagger pressed toward his throat. Panicking, Orwyn grabbed the man's wrist with both hands, straining to keep the blade away. The man's breath reeked of stale wine and madness. Suddenly, the cultist stiffened. Tishara appeared above him, dagger flashing as she drove it between his ribs. He collapsed onto Orwyn, eyes wide with shock. Orwyn shoved the body off, breathing hard. Tishara offered her hand, pulling him up. "We have to move," she urged. They looked around. The Lannister men were faring well. A few had minor wounds, but they'd slain or disabled several cultists. The chanting faltered, replaced by screams and curses. The robed woman on the ledge flung a pottery jar onto the cavern floor. It shattered, releasing a burst of acrid smoke that billowed outward, stinging eyes and throats. She turned to flee deeper into the cave. Horys coughed, motioning for half the men to pursue. Tishara and Orwyn went with them. They stumbled through the haze, hearing the retreating footsteps. The cave narrowed into a tunnel. Flickers of torchlight danced ahead, revealing the woman's cloak swirling as she hurried away. She was fast, surprisingly agile over the slick stone. Tishara loosed an arrow. It struck the wall behind the robed figure, sparking off the rock. The woman vanished around a bend. They raced after her, breath ragged. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, dominated by an uneven pool of seawater that rose and fell with the tide. A narrow ledge circled half the pool. The woman was halfway across, balancing precariously. She glanced back, her face partially visible in the torch's glow, young, with a glint of desperation in her eyes. "Surrender!" Horys shouted. She spat a curse, then attempted to dash farther. But the stone was wet. Her foot slipped and she tumbled sideways. With a scream, she splashed into the dark water. The men rushed forward to the pool's edge, shining their torches. The waves sloshed, swirling in from some underwater passage. The woman's hood bobbed in the current, then disappeared, pulled into the depths. Tishara gasped, stooping low. They saw no sign of the woman resurface. The water churned violently, foam swirling. She must have been sucked out to sea, or perhaps pinned under some hidden ledge. Either way, she was gone. They stared, grim-faced. From behind them came fresh commotion, Artha shouting for help. Tishara and Orwyn spun, torchlight dancing on the slick walls. They rushed back into the main cavern. The men had subdued most of the cultists, but one tried to crawl away, bleeding from a leg wound. Artha blocked him with a sword, forcing him to yield. Another cultist lay twitching on the ground, chanting through bubbles of blood. As quickly as it began, the skirmish ended. Horys panting ad. Rest the group. Secure the survivors. Check for any more of them. They found only 4 living cultists among the bodies, 3 men and 1 woman. The rest were dead or had fled into tunnels that possibly connected to underwater passages. It was a savage little lair. Along the cavern walls, they discovered hanging cloths daubed with serpentine symbols, reminiscent of the ones Orwyn had seen at Darkspire and High Pyre. A makeshift altar, fashioned from driftwood and sea stones, stood near the center. On it lay a carved piece of black stone that looked suspiciously like an egg, scaled ridges in the shape of swirling serpents, though it felt cold to the touch. Could that be a dragon egg? Roderick asked, half in awe. Orwyn remembered the references to a corrupted or twisted egg, sometimes called the serpent's egg. The object before him seemed too small and irregular to be a true dragon's egg, but it might be a symbolic relic. It radiated an unsettling aura, though perhaps that was just his imagination. Tishara hesitated, then picked it up, wincing as if expecting it to burn. It did not. "We'll take it," Horys decided. "Could be important." They also gathered scraps of parchment and a small chest containing curious vials of pungent powders. Tishara recognized one from the smell, a potent mixture known in some Essosi enclaves for hallucinogenic rituals. Everything pointed to a direct link with the Valyrian-themed cult. Another cell uncovered, more evidence in hand. But even as they bound the survivors and prepared to leave, Orwyn felt no triumph. The robed woman's anguished face lingered in his thoughts, the way she'd vanished beneath the sea. If she'd been a leader here, she might have known much more about the vow, about the Keeper. Now that knowledge was lost, unless the prisoners could be made to talk. A sick feeling told him they'd speak only in riddles, as the others had done. With the remaining robed figures trussed up and their meager possessions seized, the company left the cave. The tide was beginning to turn, water lapping higher at the entrance. They had to hurry before the path was cut off. Outside, the winter sky hung low, a bitter wind sweeping salt spray across the rocks. They ascended the cliffs with care, half dragging the prisoners. None of them struggled much, sullen and half in shock. Atop the cliffs, the company collected their horses and made haste away from the pounding surf. They rode back to Case under the dying light, battered but victorious. Still, an undercurrent of dread coursed through Orwyn. There were so many enclaves, so many pockets of this cult. Each one required a fight, and each time they gained only partial clues, more puzzle pieces that painted a dire picture but offered no final resolution. How many such battles would it take to rid Westeros of the vow? They spent the night at the same inn, the Sea's Sorrow, though this time they posted double watches, not trusting that the cult might not strike again. The next morning, they set out for Casterly Rock, the prisoners in tow. The folk of Case stared at them with curiosity and no small amount of fear. The group said little, wanting to avoid rumors that might spread ahead of them. On the journey back, Tishara studied the black stone egg repeatedly, her brow furrowed. She tried tapping it or holding it near the fire, but it remained inert. Could be purely ceremonial, she mused in a low voice to Orwyn. Or maybe a petrified dragon egg, though I've seen genuine Targaryen eggs in the halls at King's Landing, and they look different. This piece is carved more intricately. It might be older than any Targaryen relic. Orwyn recalled the scattered references to a serpent's egg, possibly a relic treasured by House Maegor or their followers. If so, the cult might have used it as a focus in their rituals, a symbol of the unborn dragon or Ash Wirm. Did it have any real power? Or was it simply a totem that fueled their dark imaginations? By the time they approached the rock, Orwyn felt numb. This mission was one success, but the war against the vow felt endless. They had fresh prisoners, fresh relics, but how many enclaves still lurked, hidden in remote corners of Westeros? And what if the rumored keeper orchestrated them, each cell no more than a finger on the hand of a larger conspiracy? Their arrival at the castle gates was met with a mix of relief and alarm. Guards hurried to take the prisoners into custody. Maester Alfred, looking strained, emerged to greet them, eyeing the wounded men and the black egg with equal parts fascination and dread. He escorted Tishara, Orwyn, and Horis inside for a debriefing before the lady. They recounted the events in the sea cave, sparing no detail about the chanting, the woman's flight, and her apparent drowning. The lady, seated in her high-backed chair, listened in stony silence. Daemon hovered behind her, arms folded. When they finished, the lady's mouth set in a grim line. Another nest uncovered. It seems they hide like rats along our shores. Very well. We will question these new captives thoroughly. Ser Daemon's gaze flicked to Orwyn, Tishara, and Horis. You all did well, but I suspect these enclaves are scattered throughout the 7 kingdoms, not just our domain. The question is whether the crown or any other great lord will join in stamping them out. Alfred's voice quavered with outrage. It is not a question, my lord, but a necessity. If we let them multiply, the lady raised a hand, silencing him. We have sent word to the crown already. We await their response. She eyed the black egg. This relic must be examined. For now, Maester Alfred shall keep it under lock and key, guarded day and night. And these new prisoners will be held in separate cells to prevent them from colluding. Orwyn took a small breath of relief that they wouldn't let the cult burn this item or free these prisoners easily. Tishara nodded, stepping forward. My lady, we suspect these enclaves are led by someone called the Keeper, a supposed heir of House Maegor. We have no proof, only the cultists' ravings. A flicker of unease crossed the lady's face. A bold claim. House Maegor was destroyed in the Doom, but we no longer dismiss such rumors outright. She glanced at Daemon. Double the watch, especially in the dungeons. Whoever set the archives aflame may try again. Daemon inclined his head. Yes, sister. With that, she dismissed them. As Tishara, Orwyn, and Horis exited the audience chamber, they exchanged glances. Another fragment of the puzzle added, but the whole remained elusive. Tishara rested a hand on Orwyn's arm. Let's get some rest. We'll need our strength, because this fight is far from over. He nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. There would be more journeys, more confrontations. The vow might have remained hidden for centuries, but the moment was coming when it would either be extinguished or blaze up into a conflagration. Orwyn could only pray they managed to snuff it out before the West or all Westeros was consumed in another doom, this time born of unholy pacts and shadowy dragons. Yet even as he tried to cling to that hope, Orwyn felt the faint tremor of dread that perhaps they were merely scratching the surface of a darkness older than the Targaryens, older than the Freehold itself. A darkness that had slithered through the centuries, waiting for a chance to flare to life, fed by the greed and desperation of mortals. The Keeper, if she existed, might be gathering her scattered flock. At least now, House Lannister and those who stood beside them would not be caught unaware. They would stand vigil, steel drawn, against the forbidden vow that Valyria's doom had left buried in Westeros. And for Orwyn Hill, once a nameless boy lost in the castle's shadows, there was no turning back from the path he had chosen, one that might yet determine the fate of kings and the destiny of dragons. They rested only a few hours after returning from the cave near Case, snatching mouthfuls of sleep in the cramped barracks assigned to the guards. Outside, a bitter wind rattled against the shutters, and flakes of snow whirled through the torchlit courtyard of Casterly Rock. Orwyn's muscles throbbed from the skirmish, and no matter how he shifted on the straw pallet, his bruises ached. Sleep proved elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, images of the robed woman tumbling into the black water rose behind his eyelids. He saw again the flashes of steel, the swirl of torches casting unnatural shadows. Eventually, an hour or so before dawn, true exhaustion claimed him. But it did not grant him mercy. He dreamed of an endless maze of tunnels, where a serpentine shape slithered just out of sight, whispering in Valyrian words he only half understood. He glimpsed a robed figure holding a black egg that pulsed like a beating heart. Then the maze flooded, dark water rushing in, swallowing everything. He jerked awake to a morning that arrived pale and cold. The rock's routine was already underway, servants racing about with hot kettles and fresh straw for the braziers. Outside, in the courtyard, he heard the ring of sparring swords as a knight oversaw squire practice. For an instant, he could almost pretend his life was normal again, that he was still the unnoticed foundling scurrying with messages. But the half-healed cut on his palm and the bruises on his ribcage reminded him that those simpler days lay behind. He found Tishara in the keep's lower hall, chewing a crust of bread beside a half-dead fireplace. Dark rings shadowed her eyes. She straightened when she saw him approach, and though fatigue pulled at her features, she managed a small nod of greeting. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked quietly, picking up a cup of watered ale from a nearby table. She shrugged, her usual bravado muted. "Enough to know I still live, at least. Are you all right?" He considered lying, but her expression told him she'd see through it. "Not really," he admitted in a low voice. "My head's still spinning with everything. The fights, the relic, that black egg, the prisoners we captured. Even though we've won small battles, I can't shake the sense that these enclaves are just branches of something bigger." Tishara blew out a breath. "You're not alone in that feeling. After everything, I still keep thinking about that reference to a living Maegor scion. If the Keeper really exists, we need answers that no captured devotee has given us yet." Before Orwyn could reply, footsteps echoed along the corridor. Maester Alfred emerged from around a corner, breathing heavily. 2 guards escorted him, a precaution since the arson in the archives, perhaps. He beckoned them closer, his expression anxious. "You're awake. Good," the maester said, lowering his voice. "Ser Daemon is about to question the new prisoners in the dungeons. He wants you present in case they spew more cryptic Valyrian. You've proven adept at spotting key words, even if you aren't fluent." Orwyn nodded. Tishara pushed off from the wall. "We'll come at once." They followed Alfred through the labyrinthine passages until they reached the stair leading below the rock. The dungeons smelled of old ash, moldy straw, and the lingering tang of fear that seemed to permeate every stone. Torches revealed a half-dozen men-at-arms stationed along the corridor, on alert since the infiltration that burned the archives. At the far end, where the cells lay deeper in the rock, Ser Daemon stood waiting. His presence was like a coiled spring, anger or determination, just beneath a veneer of calm. "Maester," Daemon said by way of greeting. He spared only a nod for Orwyn and Tishara, though Orwyn didn't take it personally. Daemon's focus clearly lay on the situation ahead. 2 cells stood occupied. One, the men said, contained a pair of cultists too wounded to stand. The other cell held a single prisoner, conscious but sullen. "We'll start with that one," Daemon announced in a terse voice. "He's the least injured, might still have the wits to speak." They advanced into the gloom. The prisoner was a wiry man with a narrow face, his robe torn to show a bandage wrapped around his arm. A guard had strapped him to a wooden stool so he couldn't lunge or scratch, but his eyes blazed with defiance nonetheless. Daemon took a moment to look the prisoner over, then spoke in a measured tone. "You and your fellows attacked subjects of House Lannister in a coastal cave. You're implicated in murder, abduction, and dark rites. If you want any mercy, you'll explain your cult's aims." The man snorted. "Mercy? From a Lannister?" He spat on the floor. "I'd sooner beg forgiveness from the sea." Daemon's face tightened. "I'm not here to bandy words. Start talking. Who commands you? Why gather in that cave?" A sneer curled the man's lip. He lapsed into a guttural language Orwyn recognized as Valyrian-based but archaic, full of twisting vowels. Daemon frowned, not understanding. Tishara gave Orwyn a nudge. Orwyn moved closer, struggling to parse the phrases. The prisoner muttered about the egg of shadows, the keeper's dream, and the fires beneath the waves. He kept repeating something that sounded like los drage. Orwyn tried to recall the bits of High Valyrian he had memorized. Possibly that was it is done, or something akin to an affirmation. Maester Alfred interjected softly. Ask him if the keeper is in Westeros. We need a location. Nodding, Orwyn did his best, using scraps of the language. Keeper Issa Zareth Belmon? He winced at how clumsy it sounded, but the prisoner stiffened in recognition. Then he barked a harsh laugh, twisted with contempt. She is everywhere you are not, he replied in slanted Valyrian. Then he repeated, more slowly for Orwyn's benefit. She is the blood, and the blood is the flame. You cling to false kings and empty dragons. Orwyn shivered, turning to Daemon. He says the keeper is everywhere, part of the blood. He mocks the Targaryens as false dragons. Something about the real flame belonging to their line. The old line. Daemon's eyes narrowed. He stepped toward the prisoner. We know your vow extends beyond these shores. We know you have enclaves in the mountains, the forests, and perhaps other kingdoms. But you've failed in the west. We found your lairs and destroyed them. More knights will ride soon. If you have any sense, you'll yield. The prisoner's face contorted in a manic grin. You think steel will kill the vow? He coughed, wincing from the wound on his arm. Kill me, kill all of us, and you still cannot stop what is coming. The keeper's blood runs deep in the cracks of this land. Alfred let out a low hiss. He's speaking almost poetically, but it lines up with the notion that they believe the keeper is some living scion of old Valyria, possibly House Maegor. That might be what he means by the real flame. Daemon's patience wore thin. Enough riddles. Give me a name. Where does this keeper reside? The prisoner glared, face slick with sweat. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then froze. An odd shudder rippled through his body. Tishara took an involuntary step back, alarmed by the sudden change. A spasm seized the man's features. Blood dribbled from his lips. He's convulsing, Alfred cried. One guard rushed forward. Another fumbled to unstrap the prisoner so he wouldn't choke on his own tongue. But the man's eyes rolled back. His limbs jerked violently, the stool rattling on the dungeon floor. Orwyn found himself pressing a hand to his mouth in horror, unsure what was happening. Then, with a grotesque finality, the prisoner spat out a dark, frothing liquid and went limp. Daemon barked an order. Maester! Alfred crouched, checking the prisoner's pulse. After a few seconds, he shook his head. Dead. Shock settled in the cell. Daemon's face twisted with anger. Poison? Did he smuggle a capsule? Alfred grimaced. Possible. Some of these cultists keep hidden vials, or they coat their teeth with lethal compounds. They'd rather die than betray their secrets. Tishara swore under her breath. Then we've lost him, and we've gained almost nothing but half-coherent rants. Daemon stood, fists clenched. We still have others. See if any are well enough to speak. If they appear near death, we'll gag them to keep them from swallowing poison. Felt grim, but the order was given. A pair of guards hurried off to the adjacent cell. Orwyn and Tishara followed with Alfred and Daemon, all of them rattled by the suddenness of the prisoner's demise. The second cell was smaller, lit by a single torch. 2 cultists lay on pallets, their wounds severe enough that they could barely move. A pair of guards hovered by them. At the sight of Daemon, one cultist groaned in pain, trying to turn his face away. The other was unconscious or close to it, bandaged about the torso. Both breathed shallowly. Daemon studied them, then spoke softly. Which one can speak? A guard pointed at the slightly more alert cultist, a heavy-set man with a gash across his thigh. Daemon nodded for Alfred to approach. The maester crouched, carefully checking the cultist's bandages. A quick glance told him the wound was infected. The man blinked, eyes glazed with fever, but a hint of defiance remained in his stare. "Tell us what you know," Alfred began, voice surprisingly gentle. "Your comrade just died rather than speak." The cultist swallowed, lips cracking. After a pause, he rasped something in common tongue. "I have no illusions. I'm done for. My leg festers." He coughed harshly. "Why bother?" Orwyn and Tishara hovered close, trying not to appear too menacing. But these men had sacrificed innocents, kidnapped villagers, done who knew what horrors. Compassion did not come easily. Daemon stooped low, nodding at Alfred to continue. The maester offered the man a water skin. He drank a little, trembling, then sagged back. "We only need answers," Alfred told him. "If you speak, perhaps we can end your suffering more mercifully than letting infection kill you." The cultist's sunken eyes slid to Daemon's face. "Mercy, from a lion's jaws, is still death." Daemon said nothing, but his silence carried weight. At length, the cultist let out a ragged sigh, as if resigned. "She is beyond your reach," he said, voice soft. "The vow was sealed ages ago, in blood older than your line. The keeper was chosen by the flames that devoured Valyria. A brand of that doom survived." Alfred leaned in. Where is she?" Another cough, flecks of blood spattering the cultist's lips. "We are scattered," he mumbled. "Like seeds. She calls to us. In dreams, the words are carried on the old tongues. We gather, in secret places, mountain crypts, sea caves, ancient halls." He let out a faint, delirious laugh. "You can burn every one, but still the vow remains, as long as the old blood runs in the veins of men." Tishara's expression tightened. "Stop preaching. Give us something real. A name, a location. Someone who's seen the keeper with their own eyes." The cultist's eyelids fluttered. "The keeper moves unseen. Some say she hails from across the narrow sea. Others say she was born under the shadow of the 14 flames, in a black fortress that defied the doom. Stories." He trailed off, breath rattling. Daemon's voice rose in impatience. "Stories. Nothing more. You said she calls to you in dreams. How? Is it sorcery? Is there a place you gather to meet her?" A series of spasms shook the man, and for a moment Orwyn feared he, too, would convulse and die. But after a tortured breath, the cultist's voice came back in a whisper. "We are told, when the time is ripe, the keeper will reveal herself. The vow demands a grand sacrific. Only then will the flame rise anew." Orwyn's pulse quickened. "A grand sacrifice. Did you attempt that with the villagers you kidnapped?" The cultist's stare bored into him. "A trifling offering. The true sacrifice demands something far greater." A hush fell. Alfred tried again. "Greater in what sense?" The cultist's lips twisted into something resembling a grin. "A sacrifice of royal blood." A chill raced down Orwyn's spine. He glanced at Tishara and saw her expression darken. Royal blood, blood of kings or princes, or at least the highest lines. The Targaryens came to mind instantly. So did the possibility of other ancient houses with old Undul or First Men lineage. In the cult's twisted logic, perhaps any noble line might suffice. Daemon spoke in a low, dangerous tone. "Why royal blood? You think you can birth a dragon with it?" But the man had drifted further into delirium. His eyes rolled back, and a feverish murmur escaped his lips. Alfred felt his forehead, grimacing. "He may not last the day. The infection is advanced." Cursing softly, Daemon straightened. "So that's all we have, scraps of rumor. Enough to confirm the keeper demands a grand sacrifice, and that the Targaryens or other royal lines might be targets. As if we needed more reason to involve the crown." Tishara drew a slow breath, rubbing the back of her neck. "If the keeper believes she needs Targaryen blood, that's dire. No wonder they despise the Targaryens as false dragons. They want to supplant them with a line they claim is older or more worthy." Orwyn rubbed his arms against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the dungeon's temperature. "If they aim to abduct or kill a member of House Targaryen, it'll be near impossible. The royal family is well guarded, presumably." Daemon eyed him. "The capital is large. There may be ways for a cunning cult to attempt something. All the more reason the crown must be fully warned. And not only the crown, Some in the realm might try to exploit this cult's claims. Certain lords resent Targaryen rule and might see an advantage in a new dragon-blooded line. It was a disturbing thought, but not unfathomable. Orwyn recalled how some vassals hated the Targaryens' presence in Westeros, especially lords who had lost men in the conquest. Most had grudgingly accepted Targaryen authority, but in a land of ever-shifting politics, any spark could reignite old grudges. And a secret promise of draconic power might be a mighty spark indeed. Alfred sighed, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. We'll glean nothing more from these men. I'll do what I can to keep them alive for further questioning, but it may be hopeless. Daemon nodded. Very well, let us leave them to your care, Maester. But if they show any sign of taking poison, gag them. With that, they withdrew from the cell, the guards resuming their vigilant watch. In the corridor, Daemon turned to Orwyn and Tishera. Rest up. The lady will want a full account this afternoon. I suspect we'll be sending out more riders soon, or preparing to journey to King's Landing ourselves. The matter of a grand sacrifice is too grave to keep quiet. As he spoke, a guard approached from the stair, clearing his throat. Sir Daemon, we have a visitor requesting you above. Arrived just now. Daemon frowned. Who is it? A messenger from Old Town, so he says. He carried the Citadel's seal. Alfred's eyes lit with curiosity. A maester from the Citadel? No, a sworn messenger traveling ahead of someone else. That's all I know. They're waiting in the courtyard. Daemon wasted no time. With a curt gesture, he motioned Alfred and the others to accompany him. They ascended into the main keep. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, though it offered little warmth. The corridor led them out into a courtyard where a small group of travelers stood near the stables, brushing road dust from their cloaks. One wore a surcoat bearing the sigil of House Hightower, a green tower crowned by flames. He bowed upon seeing Daemon. Sir Daemon Lannister? I bring greetings from the Citadel and from Lord Hightower. My master, Maester Seddon, follows close behind, escorting an unusual guest. They are but a day's ride behind me. Daemon's tone was brisk. And who is this unusual guest? The messenger hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. A certain scholar from Essos, said to be well-versed in Valyrian lore. Maester Seddon thought it urgent to consult with your maester, given the rumors that have reached Old Town. The Archmesters have grown concerned about talk of Valyrian sorcery in the Westerlands. A flicker of surprise passed over Alfred's features. A scholar from Essos, invited by the Citadel? Highly irregular. Usually, the Citadel does not readily trust foreigners with knowledge of old magic. The messenger half shrugged. Times change, Maester. The Archmesters do not want to be caught unprepared if there is truth to these cult rumors. Knowledge is the best weapon, they say. Daemon studied him. So your group is on its way here now? Yes, sir, likely to arrive tomorrow or the next day, depending on the roads. I was sent ahead to deliver this letter. He produced a rolled parchment sealed with wax stamped by the Citadel's links. Daemon took it and broke the seal, scanning the contents. Orwyn and Tishera exchanged a glance. Another player was entering the scene, a scholar from Essos with knowledge of Valyrian secrets. Could this be a coincidence? Or was it somehow orchestrated by those who knew about the vow? Daemon finished reading. Very well. You and your master are welcome here so long as you keep the peace. We'll find accommodations. The messenger bowed again. My thanks. I'll stable my horse and await Maester Seddon's arrival. As the man departed, Daemon gestured for Alfred to join him in private conversation. Orwyn and Tishera lingered at a respectful distance, though they could guess the discussion's tenor. New arrivals might complicate matters, especially if these scholars wanted free rein to poke around, but perhaps they could bring crucial insights. Eventually, Daemon dismissed them, ordering them once again to rest. We'll likely have a council when the Citadel's envoy arrives. The lady will expect your presence and your candor. Until then, keep alert, and do not stray too far from the keep. Orwyn bowed stiffly, heading off with Tishera. They parted ways near the kitchens, agreeing to meet later. Orwyn, drawn by hunger, found himself scarfing down a bowl of hot stew, though his appetite was dulled by anxiety. A swirl of questions tormented him. If the Citadel was mobilizing, perhaps that meant the Crown, too, would act soon. Would the cult accelerate its plans in response? And this rumored keeper, how long before she made a bold move? He recalled the cultists' final words, a grand sacrifice of royal blood. Had the enclaves been capturing peasants in the West just to practice the vile rites until they could attempt something bigger? The notion made Orwyn's skin crawl. When he finished eating, he wandered aimlessly until he wound up in the castle's old sept, a place rarely used during winter. Candles burned weakly, flickering on the worn faces of the 7 carved in stone. Orwyn wasn't much for prayer. He'd never known who his parents were or what gods they kept, but he needed a moment of stillness, a place to quiet his thoughts. He approached the statue of the crone, who held a lantern representing wisdom. He had no gift to leave. He simply stood there, breathing in the faint smell of incense, and whispered in his mind for clarity, for a path forward that didn't lead him into deeper nightmares. Tishara found him there some time later. She entered the sept softly, stopping a short distance away. "Orwyn," she said in a gentle tone that startled him out of his reflections. "Didn't expect to find you praying." He offered a rueful smile. "Me neither. Just needed quiet." She nodded, stepping closer. "I was searching for you. The guards at the gatehouse said some of Damon's men returned with news. They found tracks near the archive's postern door that lead down into a disused storeroom. They suspect the arsonist might have hidden there. No sign of them now, though." Orwyn's shoulders sagged. "So we still have a spy. That's the worry." She glanced at the statue's lantern, the meager flame trembling. "We can't let them sabotage us again. I doubt they'll attempt the same ruse twice, but who knows what they'll try next." He exhaled, frustration mingling with fatigue. "We have so many fronts to guard. The dungeons, the relics, the archives that remain, not to mention our own lives." She touched his arm lightly. "Let's do something tangible for once. Check the corridors around that storeroom. Ask the servants if they saw a stranger lurking. It's not as grand as toppling a cult, but we might learn something." Orwyn nodded, grateful for her proactive suggestion. The two of them left the sept and made their way to the lesser-used wings of the fortress, areas that rummaged in Orwyn's memory as places of dusty corridors and unused chambers. Torches were fewer here, the walls shadowed by half-light from arrow slits. They spoke with a few passing servants, a maid hauling linens, a lanky steward's helper. One had glimpsed a figure in a hood slipping through a side door 2 nights ago but assumed it was merely a guard. Another recalled hearing footsteps at odd hours but hadn't dared investigate. Nothing conclusive. The storeroom in question was locked, but Tishara coaxed the key from an unsuspecting understeward, claiming they needed to search for water damage. Inside, they found crates of old household goods, some broken chairs, moth-eaten tapestries. A thick layer of dust covered most items, but Orwyn noticed footprints near the far wall. Someone had disturbed the dust quite recently. They followed the tracks until they vanished behind a tall stack of crates. Sure enough, behind the crates was a portion of the wall that looked slightly off, poorly plastered with hairline cracks around the stones. Secret passage? Tishara guessed, eyes narrowing. Orwyn felt along the wall, pressing gently. He found a spot where the stone shifted inward a fraction of an inch. Faint squeak, but the passage refused to open. Tishara pulled a dagger and attempted to pry around the edges. No luck. Likely it required some clever mechanism to release fully. At length, she gave up, stepping back with a scowl. "We'd need a mason or someone with knowledge of the rock's old tunnels. We can't do that openly without raising suspicion." Orwyn pressed his ear to the wall but heard only silence. If someone used this to come and go, they must know how to open it from the inside. Tishara brushed dust from her trousers. "We can't just stand guard here day and night, but we have to tell someone, Ser Damon at least." He nodded. "Let's do that. Maybe we can lay a trap. If the spy returns, they'll find more than they bargained for." They left the storeroom, locking it behind them and returning the key to the understeward with casual remarks about checking for leaks. As they retreated, Orwyn's heart hammered. Another layer of infiltration. Secret passages in Casterly Rock that no one else seemed to recall. He wondered if the Rock's earliest builders had constructed hidden ways to rival those in the Red Keep or Storm's End. Over centuries, many might have been forgotten. They found Daemon at the training yard, overseeing a pair of knights engaged in drills with live steel. His expression remained taut even after the nights concluded. Once Tishara discreetly relayed what they'd found, Daemon gestured for them to follow him into a small side chamber. There, shielded from prying ears, they described the footprints and the suspicious patch of wall. Daemon's face hardened with each word. Another unknown tunnel. Gods help us, he muttered. I'll bring a trusted mason to examine it undercover. In the meantime, we'll post watchers in that corridor. If that spy comes back, we'll be ready. Tishara nodded. But be careful who you pick, Ser Daemon. We don't know how far the cult's infiltration runs. Daemon set his jaw. I'll choose men who fought with us in the caves. Men I trust with my life. They've already spilled cult blood. They won't be easily swayed by bribes or threats. With that resolved, Orwyn and Tishara retreated. The day wore on in a haze of tension. Snow fell more heavily by afternoon, muffling the fortress in a thick white blanket. That evening, Ser Daemon summoned them again for a short briefing. The lady had decided to keep all official talk of the cult behind closed doors. No announcements, no public gatherings. The Citadel's party would be welcomed quietly, but a full council would happen only in the ladies' private hall, with select individuals present. Tomorrow, Daemon told them, we'll learn more about this Associ scholar the Citadel is bringing. If he or she can shed light on House Maegor or ancient Valyrian lore, that might help. But keep watch for treachery. We can't rule out a trap. The cult might try to insert a supposed scholar who's really one of their own. His caution was well-founded, Orwyn thought. This vow was older than the Targaryen conquest, older than the founding of many houses in Westeros. Why wouldn't the cult be cunning enough to place a mole among visiting scholars? That night, Orwyn found Tishara on the walkway overlooking the sea, the same vantage from which one could see Lannisport's lights on a clear day. The swirl of winter wind cut through their cloaks, but she seemed lost in thought, leaning on the stone battlements. He joined her, exhaling a plume of steam into the frigid air. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. She angled him a glance. "I'd ask you the same. We've both been living on the edge since you found that scroll. Sometimes I wonder if we should have let it lie. But then I think of all the people the cult has sacrificed." Her breath came out in a ragged sigh. "We did the right thing, didn't we?" Orwyn touched her shoulder gently. "Yes, even if it's terrifying. We can't let them keep doing this, murdering innocents, trying to conjure some twisted version of draconic power." She nodded, glancing back at the Black Sea. "Still, a part of me misses simpler days. For you, that might be sweeping floors in the archives. For me, maybe sneaking off to ride in the hills. No grand conspiracies. No nightmares about robed figures whispering in the dark." She paused. "But we've come too far to turn away." He nodded, silently understanding. They stood there a while longer, side by side in the cold, until the wind grew too fierce and they retreated inside. Morning arrived with fresh snow piled against the walls, icicles hanging from stone eaves. Word spread quickly that the party from Old Town had been spotted on the road leading up to the rock. Daemon ordered a low-key reception. Orwyn and Tishara gathered with half a dozen others in the courtyard, waiting as the traveling party approached through swirling flurries. At the forefront rode Maester Seddon, an older man swaddled in thick robes, his chain barely visible beneath. Behind him came a covered wagon and 3 mounted guards bearing the Hightower sigil. A pale-faced man, presumably a younger steward, dismounted to open the wagon door. Out stepped a woman of middle years, tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a stern knot. She wore traveling leathers dyed a dark green, and a short cloak trimmed with fur. In her gloved hands, she clutched a staff topped with some polished black stone. Her features were sharp, with a faint scar running along her left cheek. Maester Seddon introduced her. Ser Daemon, House Lannister, may I present Ezra of Mantares, a scholar specializing in Valyrian linguistics and artifacts. She has the Citadel's endorsement to assist in your investigations. Ezra inclined her head with a certain reserved dignity, her gaze sweeping the courtyard. When she spoke, her voice carried an accent reminiscent of Essos. I thank you for welcoming me, Ser Daemon. Despite the winter storms, the Archmasters insisted my knowledge might be of use. I'm at your service for a time. Daemon, measuring her with a cool stare, offered a polite bow. You're welcome here, so long as you bring no harm. Lady Lannister has prepared chambers for you and Maester Seddon. But before we proceed, I must emphasize that we treat this matter with the utmost secrecy. She nodded, expression revealing little. I'm aware. The Citadel's letter was clear. Might we discuss the details in a more private setting? Thus, the group proceeded inside, shedding layers of snow-laden cloaks. Servants whisked their belongings away, while Ezra insisted on keeping her staff close. Orwyn, trailing behind, felt Tishra's nudge. Notice the staff's top? Looks like obsidian or Valyrian glass, she murmured. Orwyn squinted. Indeed, the polished black stone had that faintly translucent sheen characteristic of dragonglass. An odd staff for a linguistics scholar, but then again, who was he to judge? He remembered that certain enclaves in Essos used dragonglass for arcane rituals. Or perhaps it was simply a curiosity from her homeland. They gathered in a small side hall near the ladies' audience chamber. A long wooden table and a modest fireplace provided a setting for conversation. Maester Alfred was present, as were Daemon and two of his trusted men, Horace and Lyle. Tishra and Orwyn hung back a little, feeling out of place among so many of higher rank. But Daemon had explicitly asked them to attend. They had first-hand knowledge, after all, and might glean more from Ezra's references. Once everyone was seated, Daemon began. Maester Seddon, I trust your journey was safe? The older Maester nodded. Challenging in the snow, but safe enough. I bring letters from the Archmasters. He slid a sealed parchment across the table, which Alfred accepted. They express grave concern at the rumors of Valyrian cult activity. They also mention that if you have discovered any relics connected to House Maegor, we are to examine them closely. At that, Ezra leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with keen interest. House Maegor, yes. The Citadel's invitation made it clear you suspect a surviving line or at least a cult claiming that heritage. May I see the relics you've uncovered? Daemon's gaze flicked to Alfred, who cleared his throat. We have a silver chalice inscribed with obscure Valyrian runes, a short Valyrian steel blade from the fortress Darkspire, several scroll fragments describing the so-called Draconis vow, and a newly obtained black stone egg from a sea cave enclave near Case. All are in guarded storage. Ezra's lips parted in fascination. A black egg, you say? Has it shown any sign of warmth, movement, anything to suggest it's a true dragon's egg? No, Tishra chimed in, from the corner of the room. She realized belatedly that she might be interrupting, but Ezra turned to her politely. We tested it near a fire, nothing. It appears carved, perhaps artificially shaped. Yet it unsettles the eye. Ezra nodded, turning back to Daemon. Might I see it soon? You shall, Daemon replied carefully. But under watch. We can't risk letting such an item slip away or be damaged. Maester Seddon cleared his throat. Perhaps we should begin with your account of these cult enclaves. The letter we received was incomplete. So Daemon gave an abbreviated summary of the cult's discovery at High Pyre, the infiltration at Darkspire, the sea cave near Case, and the near-deadly skirmishes. He'd cribbed how the cult referred to a vow that survived old Valyria's doom, linking it to House Maegor's rumored heirs. The mention of a possible keeper, who might be a living scion, made Seddon and Ezra exchange troubled looks. When Daemon concluded, Ezra spoke softly. I have studied the lesser-known branches of Valyria's Dragonlord families. House Maegor was among the more deviant lines, even by Valyrian standards. They sought knowledge from cryptic corners, blood rituals, binding enchantments. Some claimed their dragons were larger and fiercer, but also prone to violence even toward other dragons. Maester Alfred looked intrigued. "You confirm that House Maegor had a reputation for black sorcery?" Ezra pursed her lips. "So the histories say. Yet even Valyria had limits, or so the stories claim. House Maegor supposedly offended other houses with its willingness to experiment on slaves, and even on, well, let's just say they were not squeamish about taboo practices. If they truly left behind a hidden lineage, the potential for darkness is great." Seddon shifted uncomfortably. The Archmaesters suspect that no true living scion remains. But these cultists might use the legend as a rallying cry, forging a new figurehead to claim the blood of Maegor. Perhaps some bastard with half Valyrian traits. The question is whether they've harnessed actual draconic power. A hush fell. Daemon ran a hand through his hair. "We've seen no real dragon, but they keep referencing Wyrms, as though that's a separate species or a twisted form of dragon. They also mention forging new flames from the west. Could that be a metaphor? Or a genuine attempt at breeding or hatching something?" Ezra tapped her staff lightly on the floor. "In Essos, I've heard tales of half-formed abominations in the Shadowlands beyond Ass High. Serpentine creatures rumored to be dragon spawn. But such stories are rarely verified. If House Maegor had knowledge of vile experiments, it's possible their cult is attempting something similar here, using volcanic vents or hot springs. The presence of the word ash suggests a connection to volcanic activity, reminiscent of the 14 flames." Alfred rubbed his temples. "We do have hot springs or geothermal pockets in certain areas of Westeros. The Vale has some, the north near Winterfell, the Dragonmont of Dragonstone, and scattered pockets in the Westerlands. High Pyre, for instance, stands atop mineral seams. The cult may be systematically seeking places akin to Valyria's old mountain furnace." Ezra's eyes narrowed. "Indeed, if they believe forging or hatching a new breed of dragon, an Ash Wyrm, requires conditions akin to Valyria's flame-choked mountains, they'd look for locations with strong geothermal heat. That's presumably why they've tried these enclaves near sulfur deposits or natural vents." Maester Seddon turned to Daemon. "Have you considered contacting House Targaryen directly? If the cult truly aims to sacrifice royal blood, that places the crown in immediate danger." Daemon's jaw tightened. "We have. In fact, we sent a messenger to King's Landing some time ago, after capturing our first batch of cultists. Another messenger from the crown visited here recently, though he left before we uncovered the new information about the grand sacrifice. Hopefully, he'll relay enough that the Hand and the King remain on guard." Ezra exhaled slowly. "Then perhaps we must gather more definitive proof. If the King or his advisors doubt the severity, they might dismiss it as a local phenomenon. But if we can produce an actual text or relic that details the sacrificial ritual, and specifically names royal blood, that could force action." Orwyn shifted uncomfortably. He and Tishara stood at the periphery, but Ezra's words rang true. Evidence was crucial. The rumors of Ash Wyrms and a living Maegor scion were too fantastic for many to believe without something explicit to back them up. Daemon nodded. "Then let us show you the relics now. We'll see if you can interpret more from the scroll fragments or the inscriptions on the blade. Perhaps something we missed might mention the sacrifice's nature." Ezra rose at once, as did Seddon and Alfred. Daemon instructed Tishara and Orwyn to come along. "You've both studied these relics before, or at least handled them. Your observations may help." They made their way to a secure chamber in the castle's interior, guarded by 2 men Daemon trusted implicitly, veterans of the fight in the mountain village. The men stepped aside, letting the group enter. Inside, a stout, iron-reinforced door led to a small vault-like space. Torchlight gleamed on the stone walls. On a heavy table, locked in separate chests, lay the relics. The silver chalice, the short Valyrian steel blade, the partial scrolls from Darkspire, and, most recently, the black stone egg. Daemon produced the keys, handing one to Alfred and another to Ezra after a moment's hesitation. She carefully unlocked the chest holding the egg. Tishara hovered, watching. The polished black surface caught the torchlight, swirling with faint whirls like petrified scales. Ezra set her staff aside and gently lifted the egg, cradling it in both palms. Closing her eyes, she breathed in slow, measured fashion, as if trying to sense something. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes, cold indeed, and carved in a pattern that imitates dragon scales but also suggests serpentine coils. Remarkable craftsmanship. I sense no living presence within. Tishra nodded. We suspected it wasn't a real egg. The cult used it as a focal point in their sea cave altar. Ezra set it down. Even if it's no living egg, it could be an ancient artifact that belonged to a Valyrian family. I recognize these swirling motifs from some Mantarian tomb carvings I studied years ago. In Mantaries, near the ruins of Valyria, certain families once traded in relics. Some items they sold were believed to carry residual power. Daemon frowned. Residual power? Could that be more than superstition? Ezra made a non-committal gesture. Difficult to say. Magic, if you will, is slippery, often tied to belief, bloodlines, and particular places. This object might be important only because the cult invests it with meaning, an emblem of the unhatched potential they hope to birth. Maester Seddon stepped in to examine the silver chalice. He read the runes along its rim, lips moving silently as he pieced together the archaic Valyrian. Alfred assisted, pointing to certain spots that had puzzled him for weeks. Ezra joined them after returning the egg to its chest. Watching the three scholars huddle over the chalice, Orwyn felt a surge of hope. If they deciphered a passage referencing the grand sacrifice or the keeper's location, that would be a breakthrough. The silence lengthened as they conferred in hushed tones. Tishra and Orwyn looked on, the flicker of the torches painting restless shadows across the walls. After a while, Ezra straightened, rubbing her chin. This inscription is a vow of devotion, referencing the union of blood and flame, typical of old Valyrian worship. But here, she pointed to a cluster of symbols near the chalice's base. These might form the phrase Nenegon Sobri, which could mean the ninefold sacrifice. Alfred's brows shot up. Ninefold sacrifice? I've never encountered that phrase in standard texts. Seddon nodded gravely. Nor I, but it suggests multiple victims or multiple steps. A ritual requiring 9 components, perhaps. Tishra spoke up, recalling something from the captured cultists. Could that refer to different lines of nobility or different individuals? We've seen them kidnap small folk, but the grand sacrifice might demand more. Daemon's countenance darkened. If they require 9 highborn victims, it could be catastrophic. The cult might attempt to abduct lords, ladies, or even members of the Targaryen dynasty. Or they might try to lure them somehow to a single location. Ezra drummed her fingers on the chalice's rim. We should see if the scroll fragments mention a number or a gathering. It's possible the vow includes some alignment of cosmic factors, an eclipse, a comet, a particular season. Valyrian magic often aligned with celestial events. They turned to the scrolls next. Despite water damage and partial burning, a few lines remained legible. One fragment depicted ritual instructions, references to chanting in the language of flame, the ingestion of certain herbs or potions, then a sacrifice meant to open a gate of ash. Ezra read it aloud, weaving in Alfred's and Seddon's clarifications. When the gate of ash is opened, the keeper shall call forth the old flame from the darkness, binding the blood of the vow to the living spark. And so on. Ezra translated, brows knit. It reads as if they truly believe they can summon or birth something that once existed in Valyria's heart. Alfred glanced at Orwyn. You see the repeated phrase Zobri Valma, meaning blood offering. We recognize that word from earlier cult translations. Zobri, sacrifice. Valma is offering. Orwyn shivered at the memory of the cultists chanting that same term. He nodded. Yes, and we keep seeing references to the old flame. Ezra set down the scroll. This cements the idea that it's not enough for them to take random small folk. They want something more potent, royal or noble blood, in enough quantity or significance to open the gate of ash. Horrifying, but we must assume it's more than metaphor. They're determined to try. Daemon ground his teeth. then time is of the essence. If the cult is preparing for a large-scale ritual, they may target multiple highborn individuals across Westeros. Seddon scratched his gray beard. The Citadel can dispatch warnings, but many lords might dismiss it as panic or a superstitious tale. We'd need the Crown's authority behind it to carry weight. Then the Crown must act, Daemon declared. We need to send another messenger, or better yet, a full delegation, someone who can deliver these relics in person to the Red Keep. Let the king and his council see the proof with their own eyes. Ezra spoke in a measured tone. I'd volunteer to go, but my place may be better spent continuing my study of these texts. The Archmasters would want thorough analysis, which might take weeks. And if there's indeed a hidden line of Maegor or a pretender, they may be lurking in Essos as well. My knowledge of Essosi leads could be valuable here in the West, especially if we glean new clues. Daemon nodded, considering. Ser Raymar from the Crown visited us once. He might return soon, but waiting is risky. In any case, we can't let the cult slip away. Let's do both. Send a reliable envoy to King's Landing, and keep these scholars here to decode the vow. Meanwhile, we continue scouring the Westerlands for any sign of enclaves. The group murmured agreement. Alfred closed the chests. Daemon replaced the locks, handing the keys back to the guards. The atmosphere felt charged with urgency. As they emerged from the vault into the corridor, talk continued. Ezra asked about the captured cultists, expressing a desire to question them directly. Daemon explained that most were dead or delirious, and they'd try, but results might be minimal. Eventually, they dispersed, each to their tasks. Ezra accompanied Alfred and Seddon to the Maester's tower, presumably to settle in and begin deeper research. Daemon strode off with Horace and Lyle, planning to coordinate new patrols. Tishara and Orwyn left together, heading down a passage where they could speak privately. Tishara's voice carried a thread of excitement amid her worry. At least we have direction now. The part about a ninefold sacrifice is horrific, but it's more than we had. Orwyn nodded. We need a plan to warn the realm, but House Lannister alone can't force every lord to heed the danger. Even if they did, the cult might hide or strike unpredictably. She sighed. True, and if the Crown moves slowly, he grasped her hand without fully realizing it. Then we do what we can ourselves. If this vow demands certain conditions, places of volcanic or geothermal significance, maybe we can identify them across Westeros. Focus patrols there. High Pyre was one. Darkspire, possibly. Are there others in the Stormlands, the Vale, the Crownlands? Tishara squeezed his hand, then released it, scanning the corridor. Let's bring that idea to Ezra and Alfred. They can cross-reference known hotspots. If the cult means to gather for a bigger ritual, they might choose one site that's especially strong in those volcanic energies. A spark of determination lit Orwyn's chest. Let's go. They found Alfred's chamber busy with activity. Seddon rummaging through a satchel of scrolls. Ezra carefully unrolling a large map of Westeros on a table. Alfred eyed them as they entered, though not unkindly. Orwyn, mustering his courage, explained his idea, systematically identifying locations that might match the cult's requirements. Ezra brightened. A prudent approach. Let's see. We know Dragonstone has volcanic activity beneath the castle. So does the Isle of Driftmark, though less so. The Vale has hot springs in certain valleys, though they're more geological than volcanic. The North famously has the hot springs at Winterfell, though that's quite far from here. There's also talk of sulfur vents near Storm's End. Alfred frowned, searching his memories. Storm's End is built on a cliff battered by storms. The foundations supposedly contain labyrinths. I recall references to a hidden cavern that stank of brimstone. And we have that half-remembered note from the Darkspire scroll, mentioning a black crypt beneath Storm's End. Possibly the same place. Seddon traced his finger across the map, tapping the eastern coastline below Shipbreaker Bay. Yes, the region around Storm's End might have pockets of geothermal activity. Then, if we look westward, the area near High Pyre is already known. The question is, do these enclaves each plan to do separate sacrifices, or are they all converging for one massive ritual? Tishara exhaled. We don't know, but the case cult was small compared to Darkspire. Maybe each is just a piece, waiting for the final call from the Keeper. If so, the Keeper might appear at only one chosen place, summoning the rest. Ezra nodded thoughtfully. Exactly. We should watch for gatherings near the biggest source of volcanic or geothermal intensity. Dragonstone is the strongest, I suspect, but that's heavily guarded by the Targaryens. Storm's End is next, or maybe somewhere less obvious. They worked for hours, cross-referencing notes and rummaging through Alfred's battered library for references to draconic lairs. Much had been lost in the archive fire, but scraps survived. Ezra and Seddon added details from the Citadel's records. By nightfall, they had a rough list of known or rumored hotspots in Westeros. Storm's End was prominent. The Vale's Darksong Caverns were noted as well, though the exact location was uncertain. A place called Frostfire Ridge, near the Dreadfort in the north, sounded improbable, but they included it. The Westerlands had a few lesser sites, some half-ruined. Alfred rubbed his tired eyes. This is still guesswork, but better than nothing. Ezra carefully rolled up the map. We'll show this to Ser Daemon and the lady, propose that scouts be sent to these key areas. If we can find cult enclaves in multiple kingdoms, the crown can't deny the scope. Orwyn's stomach growled. He realized he hadn't eaten since midday. Tishara must have heard it, because she offered a faint grin. We should get supper before we collapse. With that, they parted ways, leaving the scholars to tidy up. Supper in the Great Hall felt subdued, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Some folks whispered about the unusual visitors from Old Town. Others speculated on why Ser Daemon was arming more patrols. Rumors circulated of bandits in the hills, but no one spoke openly of cults. Orwyn and Tishara ate quickly, saying little. Exhaustion weighed on them. Afterward, they stepped out into the courtyard, where flurries still danced in the torchlight. Orwyn looked up at the battlements with a strange sense of foreboding. Casterly Rock was an imposing fortress, but it had proven vulnerable to infiltration. If the Keeper truly had a spy here, that spy might be biding their time, waiting for the right moment to sabotage the relics or the new knowledge gleaned from Ezra's translations. Tishara must have read his expression. We can't stand guard every hour, she murmured. But let's at least check in with Daemon, see if the watchers around that hidden passage found anything. They made their way to Daemon's Solar, a small chamber adjoining the ladies' private quarters. A guard outside recognized them and allowed them in. Inside, Ser Daemon sat at a table strewn with papers, while the lady herself paced near the hearth, her face drawn with concern. She wore a fur-lined robe, the candlelight revealing subtle lines of stress around her eyes. Daemon looked up. Good. We've just finished conferring with Ezra. She gave us a preliminary overview of the map you helped create, Orwyn. The lady paused her pacing, regarding them solemnly. She believes Storm's End is a likely target, or at least a place to watch. The Crown must be alerted. I want a delegation prepared to leave within the week. A small but well-protected group carrying these relics and the scholar's testimony to King's Landing. Daemon will choose who goes. Tishara's heart skipped. Are you sending Ezra as well? A slight shake of the lady's head. She wishes to remain a while longer, completing her research here. Her companion, Maester Seddon, might accompany the relics or might stay. He has not yet decided. But we do need someone with knowledge of these events to present them convincingly to the King's Council. She paused, giving Tishara and Orwyn a pointed look. Perhaps that should be you too. Orwyn's mouth went dry. Us? My lady, we have no standing at court. We're just... The lady cut him off gently. You're the ones who uncovered this conspiracy from the start. You've witnessed the enclaves firsthand, battled the cultists yourself. The Crown might trust the word of a knight or noble more readily, but a witness who truly knows the details can't be easily dismissed. Daemon inclined his head. I've spoken with my sister about this. I can't leave the rock right now. I must oversee our defenses, keep searching for the spy, and coordinate with Ezra. But sending a typical herald or minor Lannister cousin might yield half-truths. We need clarity. That means you. Tishara looked to Orwyn, trying to read his thoughts. His face mirrored her shock and apprehension. Travel to King's Landing, stand before Targaryens and the royal court, and speak of a doomsday cult that threatens royal blood? The idea rattled her, but it also made a certain sense. They'd be the best ones to answer in-depth questions. The lady continued, I'll write letters of introduction. You'll have an escort, some men Daemon trusts. You'll bring copies of the documents or authentic fragments that can't be easily replaced. The silver chalice, perhaps, enough to convince them. You must emphasize that if the Targaryens or other great houses ignore this, the consequences could be devastating. Orwyn swallowed hard, bowing his head. If that is your will, my lady, we'll do our best. A faint warmth flickered in the lady's eyes. I know it's a heavy burden, especially for those not born to knighthood or court intrigue, but you've proven your courage and your insight. I believe you're up to the task. Tishara's breath shuddered in her chest. For a bastard daughter of Dorne, now a lady's companion in the West, to be entrusted with such a mission was almost unimaginable. But so was everything else that had happened these past months. She drew herself up. I'll do whatever it takes to protect the realm from this cult. Daemon gave a curt nod. Then we'll prepare. The roads are poor in winter, but we'll take the safest route. It's still a journey of many days. Expect dangers on the way, bandits or even cultists who might try to intercept you. We'll arrange for additional secrecy about your departure, so the spy doesn't sabotage you. The lady turned back to the hearth, gazing at the flames as if seeking omens. Gods be with you both. As soon as the arrangements are set, you'll leave. Keep your eyes open for allies at court. There may be some who realize the threat is real. Appeal to them if the king or his advisors prove dismissive. Orwyn and Tishara bowed, hearts pounding. The conversation ended shortly thereafter, the lady dismissing them with quiet encouragement. They left the Solar in a daze, walking side by side down a drafty corridor. So they would be journeying to King's Landing, the seat of Targaryen power. Felt unreal but also inevitable. Later, in the deserted library antechamber, they sat on a bench to collect themselves. A single candle offered dim light. Tishara spoke first, voice trembling slightly despite her best effort to sound calm. We should plan carefully. Our words will carry weight or they'll be ignored. We need to present the evidence systematically, explain how we found the cult, how it's connected to House Maegor. We can't just rattle off incoherent warnings about doom. Orwyn nodded, taking her hand in his. His own voice was low. Agreed. We'll bring the scroll fragments, maybe that black egg, if they let us, or the chalice. Show them the runes that demand a grand sacrifice of royal blood. That should get their attention. Tishara exhaled, her grip tightening. We'll be traveling across half the realm in winter. The journey itself could be as dangerous as the cult. But we can't turn back. It's the only way to rally enough support to stop them. Their eyes met in the candlelight, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. From the moment Orwyn had pried open that strange seal in the archives, their lives had been on a path leading far beyond Casterly Rock's walls, beyond even the Westerlands. They were stepping into the heart of the Seven Kingdoms, and perhaps into the jaws of something older and darker than any mortal throne. They parted for the night, each needing rest before the storm ahead. Orwyn tried to sleep, but his mind buzzed with anticipation, fear, and an odd flicker of excitement. Bastard-born or no, he was about to stand before lords and ladies who shaped the fate of kingdoms, carrying secrets that could rattle the foundations of power. Dawn came with more snow. Preparations began in earnest. Daemon quietly gathered half a dozen men-at-arms who would serve as escort. He handpicked them from those who had fought cultists. They loaded supplies onto sturdy horses, food, blankets, traveling gear. The lady drafted letters with her official seal, addressed to the hand of the king and other key figures at court. Alfred helped copy relevant passages from their partial texts, so Orwyn and Tishara wouldn't have to bring the originals. But the chalice, at least, would go with them for physical proof. Over those frantic 2 days, Ezra continued her research, promising to remain in the West for a while, in case new enclaves were discovered. She believed the vow might run deeper still. Maester Seddon, after some deliberation, chose to stay as well, preferring to gather knowledge on the ground rather than ride to King's Landing in winter. Daemon assured them both that a careful watch would be maintained on the relics that remained. The black egg especially would not leave the rock. On the eve of departure, Orwyn stood in the stableyard, checking his borrowed horse's saddle and packs. Snow drifted lazily from a leaden sky. Tishara finished stowing arrows in her quiver, pausing to watch him with a slight smile. Hard to believe we'll be on the King's Road soon. You ever thought your life would turn out like this? He let out a soft laugh, bittersweet. Never. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still dreaming in that old bunk behind the kitchens. But no, it's all too real. She laid a hand on his shoulder. We'll face it together. Before he could reply, Daemon strode up. He wore a thick cloak embroidered with the Lion of House Lannister, a sword belted at his side. Though he wouldn't be traveling with them, he had come to check final details. He scanned the small column of men, 6 guards with a wagon containing supplies, 1 horse each for Orwyn and Tishara, and a single squire holding Daemon's standard, though it would remain furled for secrecy. Here, Daemon said, handing Tishara a sealed leather tube. This contains the lady's letters, plus a personal message from me to the hand. Keep it safe. She tucked it carefully into a saddlebag. Daemon turned to Orwyn. And you guard that chalice. The crown must see those runes for themselves. Orwyn nodded, touching the small, iron-bound chest strapped behind his saddle. Inside lay the silver chalice, wrapped in cloth. Yes, Sir Daemon. Daemon's gaze softened slightly. You've done well, both of you. I won't lie, this mission is perilous. But your honesty and knowledge might save the realm from a threat no one else sees clearly. Ride swift. Trust your guards. Return once your duty is done. Tishara and Orwyn both bowed. Daemon clasped their forearms, then stepped back to address the guards. You serve House Lannister by protecting these two on their journey. Any man who deserts or fails in his duty will answer to me. He paused, letting that sink in, then added quietly, and if the cult attacks, you know how to respond. The men nodded solemnly. They were veterans of the prior skirmishes. Although none wore fancy armor, just boiled leather or simple mail, they possessed resolve. Each had faced the cult's blades. Soon, the lady arrived to see them off, accompanied by Maester Alfred and Ezra. The lady offered no grand farewell, just a dignified inclination of her head and a final admonition. Do your utmost. Speak with the king's voice if you can. Warn them. Bring unity against this vow, or we may all pay the price. With that, the small column passed through the gates of Casterly Rock, heading east. Snow crunched under the horses' hooves. Lannisport lay below the rock's promontory, its harbor iced at the edges, ships creaking in the wind. They took a winding path around the city's outskirts, aiming to join the main road that would eventually link to the Gold Road toward King's Landing. Tishara rode beside Orwyn, scanning the hills. We should remain vigilant from the start, she murmured. The spy in the castle might have slipped out ahead of us. Orwyn nodded. We'll rotate watch each night. The men are prepared. They pressed on, day by day, through a landscape gripped by midwinter's teeth. The roads were rutted, sometimes icy. In villages, they found folk anxious and short on supplies. Yet no one hindered them. They did their best to travel incognito, not flaunting Lannister banners. Now and then, Orwyn found himself marveling at how far from home he'd come. He'd never dreamed of crossing half the realm, carrying a chest with a relic of possible black sorcery. At night, huddled around a meager fire, he read and reread the lady's letters, practicing how he might speak to the hand if given the chance. Tishara helped him refine the words. She, too, was stepping into uncharted territory, but she had more experience dealing with nobility. The King's Road, once they reached it near the crossroads of the Gold Road, proved no kinder. Snow piled in drifts and travelers were few. The guard captain, a man named Mandon, urged caution at every bend. Bandit sightings were common in winter, and the cult might have hidden allies. Twice, they glimpsed suspicious figures lurking near the tree line, but the men brandished crossbows and drove them away. As the days stretched into a fortnight, the columns of smoke from scattered farmsteads grew rarer. They forded half-frozen streams, camped in rundown inns when available, or else pitched tents. Tishera's skill at archery kept them supplied with the occasional hare or grouse to supplement salted rations. Through it all, Orwyn couldn't help scanning every stranger's face, wondering if they served the vow. Gradually, the land eased from the mountains and hills of the west into rolling plains leading toward the interior. Rivers cut through the snowy fields. They passed an outlying keep with a small garrison. Men eyed them warily, but Mandon produced a letter from the lady, ensuring safe passage. Rumors drifted of unrest in the Stormlands, of raiders or perhaps sellswords skirmishing in remote valleys. But no one spoke of Valyrian cults. One evening, as they approached a ramshackle inn near a frozen lake, a horse threw a shoe. They had to stop for the local blacksmith to remedy it. While the others settled in the inn's rough common room, Tishera stepped outside to check the stables. Orwyn followed, drawn by her absence and uneasy about leaving her alone in the dark. A thin moon hung overhead. The stable smelled of damp straw and horse sweat. Tishera was brushing down her mare, her breath pluming in the chill air. She glanced up, smiling faintly at Orwyn. "Just wanted to be sure she's all right." She stumbled earlier. He nodded, leaning against a wooden post. "We've come a long way. Surprised the horses are holding up so well." She set aside the brush, quietly studying him. "Tomorrow we'll cross the border into the Crownlands, if Mandon's map is right. Then it's another few days to King's Landing." Orwyn swallowed. "How do you feel about that?" Tishera exhaled, her breath a ghost in the cold. "Nervous. The Targaryens built the Red Keep on a hill once scorched by dragon flame. Stories say Aegon the Conqueror's footprints are still burned into the rock. Hard to imagine telling them that another line of Valyrians might exist, one that means to bring ruin." He moved closer, a hesitant smile tugging his lips. "We'll do it together. I'll try not to faint in front of the throne." She laughed softly, a sound that warmed the stable's gloom. "No fainting, Orwyn Hill. Though if we're lucky, we won't have to face the king directly. The Hand might handle it. Still, Targaryens. I've never actually met one." He shook his head. "Nor I. I only ever saw them from afar years back, when they visited Lannisport. They seemed otherworldly. Pale hair, sharp features, an aura of power. But that might just be illusions built by rumor." Tishera pressed her hand briefly to his cheek. "We'll see soon enough." In that moment, her hand was warm despite the chill. Orwyn gently wrapped his fingers around hers, letting the contact steady them both. Outside, the night was still, the only sound the faint huff of horses. Suddenly, a muffled footstep at the stable's entrance made them pull apart, both pivoting to see who approached. Mandon peered in, clearing his throat. "Apologies for interrupting. Just checking if all's well." Orwyn's cheeks flushed. "Yes, Captain. The mare's fine." Mandon nodded, though amusement flickered in his eyes. "We'll post a watch behind the inn. This area is known for thieves. Try to get some rest soon. We ride at first light." They returned inside, the flicker of embarrassment mingling with the closeness they'd shared. Despite the infiltration and the looming dangers, moments like that reminded Orwyn that he and Tishera had each other's backs. And perhaps each other's hearts, though it went unspoken. The next days blurred. Snowstorms lashed them, turning roads into mushy slush by midday that froze solid again overnight. More than once, the wagon got stuck, and everyone had to dismount and push. Yet they pressed on, guided by Mandon's iron determination. At last, the air began to change, growing slightly milder as they descended into the Crownlands. They saw more villages, better-traveled roads, travelers heading to or from the capital. By the time they glimpsed the walls of King's Landing in the distance, nearly 3 weeks had passed since they left Casterly Rock. Orwyn's body ached in every muscle, and Tishera's face showed the rigors of the journey. But seeing the sprawl of the city along Blackwater Bay reminded him that they were truly nearing their goal. Dozens of ships dotted the bay, their masts jutting skyward. The city's walls looked formidable, though dwarfed by the looming shape of the Red Keep perched atop Aegon's high hill. "King's Landing," Mandon muttered, letting out a breath of relief. "We made it." Tishara reined in her mare beside Orwyn. "What happens now?" "We approach the gates, show the Lannister seals, request an audience with the Hand. The city's busy even in winter, so we'll need to be patient. But once we're inside, you two will present your letters. Then it's up to the Targaryens." Orwyn stared at the distant fortress, heart pounding. The seat of power in all the Seven Kingdoms, home to the Iron Throne forged from 1,000 swords. The place he and Tishara must deliver a warning of dire cultic threat. Even from afar, the Red Keep exuded an austere majesty. Banners flew on ramparts, and somewhere in those halls, the king or his council would decide whether to heed them or dismiss them. They advanced into the city's outskirts, passing ramshackle huts, then sturdier buildings. The smell of smoke and waste assaulted them. King's Landing was larger than Lannisport, a chaotic sprawl of winding streets. Crowds thronged the gates, and the city watch in their golden cloaks kept order. Mandon spoke with a guard, presenting the Lannister seal. After a tense moment, they were allowed entry, guided through the gates into the hustle of the city proper. The first impression was noise and smell. Vendors hawking wares, beggars calling out, smithies clanging. Their small column drew stares, especially with the Lannister badge displayed by Mandon's surcoat. People parted warily as they rode deeper along the main thoroughfare that climbed toward the Red Keep. More gold cloaks eyed them, curious but respectful. At the gate of the gods leading into the keep's outer ward, the watch again challenged them. Mandon repeated their purpose. They bore urgent letters from Lady Lannister to the Hand, concerning matters of the realm's safety. The watch commander scratched his jaw, then waved them through, assigning a pair of gold cloaks to escort them inside. Past the outer gate, across a broad courtyard, they reached the entrance to the Red Keep itself. Dark red stone loomed overhead. The scale of it dwarfed Orwyn, making him feel as if a giant had raised these walls. More guards, more questions, until they were told to dismount in the stable yard. The wagon was taken aside. Mandon insisted on personally holding the key to the chest containing the chalice, refusing to let it out of his sight. A steward approached, a thin man in fine livery. He eyed the group, Orwyn, Tishara, Mandon, and the 4 men-at-arms left after a pair peeled off to guard the wagon, then said with crisp formality, "My lords and ladies, if you'd follow me. The Hand has been notified of your arrival. He's granted an audience in a lesser hall." That was quick, Orwyn thought, his pulse throbbing. They hardly had time to brush travel dust from their cloaks before being hustled inside. Tishara shot him a sidelong glance, her expression a mixture of nerves and determination. He swallowed, nodding slightly. It was time. They followed the steward through a maze of corridors lit by torches and windows that admitted weak winter light. The architecture seemed both grand and forbidding, with high ceilings and imposing tapestries. Guards in Targaryen livery stood at intervals, silvered helms shaped like dragons. Occasionally, a passing courtier would glance curiously at them. The steward led them to a set of double doors guarded by more gold cloaks. They entered a hall less imposing than the throne room, but still richly appointed with polished floors and ornate pillars. At the far end stood a dais with a carved seat. Before it, a handful of advisors lingered in quiet conversation. One wore the badge of the Hand pinned to his doublet, a serious-faced man with dark hair streaked by gray. He turned as they approached. "Ser Mandon of House Lannister, yes?" he greeted, voice calm but holding an undercurrent of authority. Mandon bowed. "Yes, my lord. I have letters from Lady Lannister for you. Also, these two, Orwyn Hill and Tishara Sand, bear witness to urgent matters." The Hand studied Orwyn and Tishara. Hill and Sand, from the rock. Unusual. His tone was not exactly mocking, but it held a faint note of curiosity. Tishara stepped forward, controlling her nerves. She bowed in the Dornish manner, Orwyn imitating her. "My Lord Hand, we come with grave news of a threat that spans multiple regions. Lady Lannister wishes the crown to hear it. Here are her sealed letters. She retrieved the tube from her saddlebag. A gold cloak took the tube, handing it to an aide, who then presented it to the hand. He broke the seals, scanning the documents. A hush fell in the hall, broken only by the crackle of torches. Orwyn felt sweat bead at his temple despite the chill in the air. He couldn't read the hand's expression, which remained impassive. Eventually, the hand looked up. These letters speak of a conspiracy tied to Valyrian sorcery, claiming it threatens the crown directly. You have relics? Evidence? Mandon nodded, motioning to one of the men-at-arms, who stepped forward with a small chest. We brought a silver chalice etched with Valyrian runes referencing sacrificial rites. Our Lady begs you to examine it. The hand gestured for an advisor to receive the chest. Another set of locks undone, and then the advisor withdrew the chalice, carefully unwrapping the cloth. A flicker of interest stirred among the few lords and knights present. The runes caught the torchlight eerily. Tishara cleared her throat. That chalice was found in an enclave of cultists who practiced blood sacrifice, chanting about resurrecting an old flame from the doom of Valyria. The hand cast her a keen look. A bold claim. Do you have first-hand accounts? Orwyn forced down his nerves and spoke. Yes, my lord. We fought these cultists ourselves. They performed unholy rites in a hidden fortress, at a tower called High Pyre, at a ruin called Darkspire, and in a sea cave near Case. They talked of forging a new draconic power, separate from the Targaryens. They also threatened that royal blood would be needed for their final ritual. A murmur swept the gathered audience. The hand lifted a hand for silence. You say this group references House Maegor? That ancient line supposedly destroyed in the Doom? Orwyn nodded. Yes, my lord. They claim a living scion still exists, or at least they follow someone who calls herself the Keeper, who claims that blood. We've seized other fragments that mention forging a new dragon-like creature called an Ash Wyrm. They specifically mention the need for sacrifice from a line of kings. At that, one of the hand's advisors spat. Outrageous. House Targaryen is the rightful line of Valyria. No other. And if they seek to harm the crown, that's treason. Mandon took a step forward. Which is why Lady Lannister begs the king's immediate attention. This 3T extends beyond the Westerlands. Our intelligence suggests cult enclaves in multiple regions. We risk losing lords or even members of the royal family if we do nothing. The hand tapped a finger on the arm of his seat. Dark rumors indeed. I must confer with the king's small council. The crown cannot dispatch armies on the basis of rumor, but neither dare we ignore evidence of possible conspiracies. For now, you shall be lodged in the Red Keep as guests. We'll examine your relic, question you further, and decide how to proceed. Tishara hesitated. My lord, I realize you need time, but the cult may already be moving. If you or your council can dispatch at least some men. The hand raised an eyebrow. You presume to direct me? She flushed. Forgive me, my lord. I only speak from urgency. He considered her, then sighed. Urgency is noted, but the king's city must be managed with order. I'll have you appear before the small council within a few days, after I've reviewed Lady Lannister's letters in detail. For now, rest from your journey. You've done well to bring this to our attention. He gave a subtle nod, and the audience was ended. Orwyn released a pent-up breath, bowing again alongside Tishara and Mandon. The steward ushered them from the hall. Their footsteps echoed in the corridor, tension thrumming in the air. Once outside, Mandon muttered, Well, it could have gone worse. The hand seems cautious but not dismissive. Tishara rubbed her arms. We can't let them take too long. The cult might strike any day. Orwyn agreed silently, but for now they had to wait. The steward assigned them rooms in one of the keep's lesser towers. Unlike the grand apartments for high lords, these chambers were modest, but they had shutters against the cold and a small fireplace. Mandon and the guards were housed nearby, ensuring they could watch over the relics. That night, after a meager meal in the keep's second-level hall, far below the lavish feasts of the king's upper halls, Tishara and Orwyn retired to their tower. Standing by the narrow window, Orwyn stared out at the flickering lights of King's Landing. The city spread below, a maze of rooftops and winding streets. Beyond the walls, the Blackwater Bay glimmered darkly, dotted with ship lanterns. Overhead, the Red Keep's higher ramparts loomed, the seat of Targaryen power. Tishara joined him, leaning her shoulder against his. "I expected something else, maybe more grandeur. It's big, sure, but it feels uneasy." He nodded, recalling the slums they'd passed, the suspicious eyes in the street. Cities in winter are always on edge. Food grows scarce, prices rise. People get desperate. She sighed, her breath clouding the chilled air. "We'll have to muster all our courage at that council. We can't let them brush this off. The cult is real. We have the scars to prove it." He turned, meeting her gaze. "We'll stand firm. We did what we set out to do, reach the crown with proof. Now it's in their hands whether they'll heed it or not." In the flickering candlelight, her eyes gleamed with resolve. "We won't let it end in a shrug. If they balk, we'll press the truth until they can't ignore it. This vow won't be allowed to fester." Orwyn felt a surge of admiration. He squeezed her hand gently. "Agreed. We faced them together." They doused the light and tried to rest, though sleep came slowly. Beyond their shuttered window, the city's murmur rose and fell, blending with the wind that swept in from the bay. Tomorrow or the next day, they would stand before the king's small council. Lords, advisors, perhaps even Targaryens themselves. They carried within them the revelations that might shape the destiny of dragons in Westeros. For better or worse, their moment of truth was nigh. And somewhere out there, in the scattered enclaves across the Seven Kingdoms, the cult of the Keeper continued its dark work. Every passing night might bring them closer to that dreaded ninefold sacrifice and the unholy dream of an Ashwm reborn. If the crown chose an action, the vow could spread like wildfire, feeding on fear and ambition until no corner of the realm was safe. Yet for now, Orwyn and Tishara had done their utmost. They would find the words to rally those in power or perish in the attempt. Darkness and flame clashed in the realm's shadows, and the illusions that House Targaryen alone possessed the dragon's magic might soon be shattered. For the vow that had slithered westward from the doom of Valyria was still alive, hidden beneath centuries of dust and denial. In the hush of that cold King's Landing night, as Orwyn finally drifted to a fitful sleep, he dreamed again of serpentine shapes coiling in a labyrinth of rock and flame. This time, though, the dream ended with a vision of a bright silver chalice shattered on the ground, and a monstrous silhouette rising behind it, wings of ash unfolding in the gloom. A single, terrible roar echoed through his mind before the dream collapsed into darkness. He woke, heart pounding, to faint dawn light creeping through the shutters. The day of reckoning had arrived. All they could do was brace themselves, step forward into the uncertain halls of power, and pray that the realm's lords would listen, before the vow's forbidden flame consumed them all.